Hello, hello, Paige. You did make it. You're either a few hours or a few minutes early, or I am a couple minutes late. We're going to begin today's episodes right away. We're going to cover 7 and 8. Both have to do with Lori Vallow Daybell. These were our most requested podcast episodes. The next few people wanted to hear all about Lori Vallow Daybell. John, as he mentioned, wanted to cover Chad Daybell first, which we did in detail. For those of you who want to go back and watch those, head to our playlist, our Beyond the Veil playlist, or our watch series. These are all connected to the same playlist. You can listen through. Hello, Annalise. Hello, Stephanie. I will go ahead and start today's episodes. As always, please hit like, please subscribe. For those interested in Dr. Babe's book club, head to patreon.com/hidden true crime. They're going to be discussing a movie this week on Wednesday. And for those of you that are new to our podcast, hit our playlist. Go ahead and watch. These are 3 years old before FOIA documents were released, before we had talked to additional people, and before we had learned more. So anything that I want to correct or share, any insider information, I'll be writing in this chat, this stream chat, and you can see what I share there. If anybody has any questions, also write it there. If you want to participate in the chat, hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. It's the best way to kind of slow the chat down. All right. Hey, everyone. We'll go ahead and start sharing. Share screen. Oh, and which one is first? So we'll start with Beyond the Veil, the making of Lori Vallow Daybell, episode 7. Oh, and one other thing, this shows that it's made through Podbean. We are not on Podbean anymore. We are with Red Circle, the Red Circle Network. So we don't have the latest cover art on these. They were some of our very first videos. They were our very first videos on YouTube. So you can see they're a bit old. Let's see. We'll go ahead and press. Hidden, a true crime podcast. A forensic psychologist. This is not it. But how that happened, I do not know. 1 second. Hidden, a true crime podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way.
She also had doubt. And she, on occasion, 2 or 3 times said to me, if Chad is Satan, he sure is a good one. So that tends to lead me to think that she wasn't 100% convinced either.
That she may have doubted Chad too.
Yeah.
This is Lauren Matthias.
And I'm Dr. John Matthias.
And what you just heard was Melanie Gibb, Lori Vallow Daybell's best friend, during an interview with East Idaho News's Nate Eaton.
I wanted to lead with that because I think it's going to set the theme for our podcast today. Today, we're going to be looking at Lori Vallow Daybell in depth. I know a lot of you have been anxiously awaiting this moment, so
it has arrived.
Right. Thanks for the patience. Thanks for hanging in there and waiting. Here we are. And let me tell you, this is a real tangled web that we're going to try to unravel here. So be patient, stay with us, and we will get you to some reasonable understanding by the end, I hope. So I wanted to lead with that comment by Melanie Gibb, because I think in most criminal situations that I've been involved with, there's always these moments when a major choice is made. Oftentimes, those moments involve a certain amount of self-reflection, which isn't necessarily a common element of a lot of criminal undertakings. But this is one of those moments for Lori. When I heard Lori say this, it reminded me of a moment in Shakespeare's famous play, King Lear, where King Lear, in the beginning of the play, he sits down with his 3 daughters and he's dividing up the kingdom. And one of his daughters refuses to play along with him. So he disinherits her effectively, and he's leaving. And the Earl of Kent, who's one of his best advisors, takes him aside. And the Earl of Kent says to Lear, See better, Lear. Let me still remain the true blank of thine eye. And what Kent is telling Lear essentially is, why can't you see this? Why can't you see that your daughters are playing you? Why can't you see that you're making this horrendous mistake? And Lori, in that moment, has a moment of self-reflection where she thinks, maybe I'm going down the wrong path.
Just maybe Chad might be Satan.
Right. But as in King Lear, where Kent gets banished from the kingdom, Lori doesn't see better. And of course, the entire tragedy unfolds. I want to stay with this idea of seeing today, because I think this is going to be a really important metaphor for understanding Lori. Seeing, or seen better, as Shakespeare says, is a really powerful metaphor throughout all great literature. It can be a really important guiding metaphor for us today. So let me bring in another well-known myth from Greek mythology, which is also about seeing, which is the myth of Narcissus. In the parable of Narcissus, Narcissus essentially becomes smitten with his own image. He becomes smitten with himself. He spends all of his days and all of his time looking at his reflection or his image in the water in a pond. Eventually, over time, because he never eats or sleeps or takes care of himself, Narcissus dies from the lack of any type of nurturance, either internally or externally. The reason why I want to bring this up, this myth, is because in 1994, two psychologists, Stephanie and Robert Pressman, wrote a book called Narcissistic Families. And I want to start there. I want to start with narcissistic families. I think it's important to mention when I talk about this book that the conditions that the Pressmans identified as constitutive of narcissistic families also can have a wider appeal and include sociopathic families or histrionic families or borderline families. In other words, the conditions that are necessary to create a narcissistic family are going to be the same conditions that would create a sociopathic family or a histrionic family or a borderline family. And what I mean by that is, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there's a cluster called Cluster B of personality disorders. And in that cluster, there's 4 different personality disorders which are identified. The important thing to know about this cluster is that there's a lot of overlap between these different diagnoses.
It's almost like a Venn diagram. Would you say there's?
Yeah, right. It's a Venn diagram. I think that's one of the criticisms of personality disorders is that they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
If somebody has antisocial personality disorder, which is sometimes also referred to as sociopathy or psychopathy, and I'll talk about that a little more later, they might also have a lot of the characteristics of narcissism. Or histrionic personality or borderline. The Pressmans, when they wrote this book, they were specifically talking about the conditions that led to narcissistic families. It's important to mention that because of the overlap, many of the conditions they're identifying would also apply to other types of families and also to the creation of, in many of these cases, children who have these types of personality disorders. Instead of focusing specifically on a personality disorder that Lori might have, I think it would be more useful in this case to step back and to identify what goes on in what the Pressmans call a narcissistic family, and then to look at that and to look at how that influenced Lori and whether, in fact, there is a diagnosis that we need to assign to her. I know there's been a lot of speculation on the groups that we're involved in.
A lot
That Lori is borderline or antisocial or histrionic.
Or a psychopath.
Right. And even in one of the psychological evaluations that I looked at, there's some mention of these terms and these diagnoses. So
An evaluation referring to Lori.
Right, referring to Lori's evaluation. Actually, the evaluation was of Joe Ryan.
Okay, right, during their custody battle.
But Lori was interviewed. So what are the conditions? The Pressmans identify 3 elements of narcissistic families. Let's start with the first one. The first one is what they called skewed responsibility. What they mean by that is as children get older and seek to become individuals, as they seek to differentiate themselves from their parents, the parents become threatened by that. Essentially what happens is the parents shift responsibility from raising the children to putting their own needs first. So responsibility shifts from being normal, nurturing parents to essentially reversing the roles where the children become the caretakers for the parents.
Is this an example of how Colby, Lori's son, JJ, and Tylee's older brother, mentioned that his mom started treating him more like a boyfriend as he got older?
Exactly. It's a role reversal. The parent should always be the parent. The child should be the child. And there shouldn't be a lot of confusion over that. Typically, one of the parents is going to have some type of personality disorder that's going to create the narcissistic family.
That makes sense.
Usually, you won't see this when the children are young because basic needs are met fairly easily. This starts coming into play as children get older and they start developing their own personalities and they start having their own voices and opinions. That's when parents get threatened. That's when parents seek to have their children become a reflection of themselves. And that's the second condition the Pressmans identify. Children react and reflect parental needs so that they receive validation through becoming some version or extension of their parents. There's that old cliche about if the acorn falls too close to the oak tree, to the mighty oak tree, that the acorn doesn't get any sunlight or nurturance and fails to grow and thrive. It's a bit like that. Let's think about the acorn not taking root because it's too close to the towering oak tree. Let's bring in Barry Cox to start this analysis.
Barry L. Cox.
Barry L. Cox.
Barry L. Cox is Lori's father.
Barry is the oak tree. His kids are the acorns. They're not falling far from the tree. They're not taking root. So what do we know about Barry Cox and why would he be the oak tree? Well, let's start with the fact that Barry has been an avid anti-government, anti-IRS advocate for many years. In 2019, he published a book.
The book was actually published while the kids were missing. How the American Public Can Dismantle the IRS by Barry L. Cox. Learn how the IRS is a criminal organization which must be abolished as a matter of law.
Barry's basic argument, as far as I understand it, I don't have the patience to get through this entire book. You'll have to excuse me for that.
And that
but
says a lot because he has read Chad's books.
I definitely lost a few brain cells reading Chad's book, but I think I was starting to slough off so many brain cells from reading Barry's book that I had to stop at some point. But as far as I can tell, his essential argument is that God sets the laws and that God does not find the IRS to be a very
noble or good organization.
right. That God does not believe that the IRS is an organization that benefits humankind. Here's a passage from the book.
American law is unique. It is predicated upon the inspired words of God the Father, the creator of all things, who personally appeared to Moses to give the 10 Commandments as written and published in the Bible's first 5 books of the Old Testament. These laws were intended to peacefully govern the liberated tribes of Israel from 400 years of bondage. He then quotes Exodus chapter 3, 7 through 8. And then he goes on. The image of the most respected Old Testament prophet Moses was carved into the face and walls of the United States Supreme Courthouse in Washington, D.C. In very deed, this honored courthouse, built in 1935, is a gallery of the Bible scriptures featuring the 10 Commandments, which contain the wisdom of God's laws for governing a peaceful and righteous society within the United States of America. The early patriots of the United States of America believed in God and in caps, Jesus Christ.
So did you notice that there's no mention of the IRS in any of that? I think that if I was writing a book on abolishing the IRS, I might consider mentioning the IRS in the first paragraph or two. But no, we don't get that. So let's look at what this means. The IRS is basically a collection agency. The IRS's job, as I understand it, is to collect money from the American public, and Congress determines the rate at which that money will be collected and how it will be spent. So to me, the IRS really tries to be apolitical. Now, I'm sure many of you aren't big fans of the IRS. I know none of us probably enjoy having a fair amount of our paychecks taken out and spent by the government in a way that we have very little control over. However, I think most of us would recognize that the purpose of the IRS is to collect money essentially to benefit the community. The community, in this case, being the United States. So the broader community. In theory, the purpose of the IRS is pro-social. It's
Right.
to take money to benefit others. We may not always agree with how that money's spent or who the others are that are benefited, but the point is it makes us a part of the community. The very idea that you think that your chunk of earnings should not be given back to the community in any way whatsoever, at the very least, this suggests a massive amount of entitlement. And I think when you perceive the IRS as an enemy and as an organization that's trying to steal your money, you're essentially saying, I don't care about the community. I don't want to participate in the community. I don't agree with how the community is going to spend my money. There's a huge sense of entitlement. Also, when you take on the IRS, I mean, wow. In 1997, Barry Cox sued the IRS
Yes,
personally.
he did.
He lost, and he actually ended up having a big chunk of his assets garnished because he had refused to pay taxes,
including his house.
for
And he
so many
spent some
years.
time in prison, but he didn't learn a lesson. He got out and years later decided to write a book.
Right, taunting them.
That's normal.
In addition to this sense of entitlement, I think it would be fair to say that there's a huge amount of grandiosity here. If you're grandiose enough to think you can take on the IRS and win, man, you're more power to you, because that's not something I have the energy to do. Grandiosity, this idea is bringing us closer to the idea of narcissism. Grandiosity is probably one of the most important characteristics of narcissists. To take on the IRS, to not pay taxes for years, to think that the rules don't apply to you. All of these are very antisocial ideas. All of these are narcissistic ideas. I think there's a message here that there's no limits, that the limits don't apply to him, that he can do whatever he wants. I talked a little bit last week about the state of Arizona pressing charges against him for distributing flyers for his law practice when he wasn't licensed to practice law.
Right.
So again, this is another area where he thinks the rules don't apply to him, where he can simply practice law without a degree or a license, and that's fine because he knows more than we do.
And as you pointed out, the irony, he's saying, I can practice law
I can practice law
without following the law.
Right. I can practice law without the law applying to me. So
Right.
It applies to you. It doesn't apply to me. And again, grandiosity. Another thing that's interesting about Barry Cox is in the letter that Barry Cox wrote to the courts when his daughter Stacy was engaged in a custody battle with Steve Cope.
Stacy is Lori's older sister, now deceased. She died years ago.
Barry wrote a letter to the courts. I'm going to quote him. Here's what he said. He told Steve, quote, I told him that a wife was like a delicate flower and needed to have tender love and care, that a husband was like a gardener who needed to provide nurturing care to see the flower flourish and bear fruit. He was indifferent to my suggestions. What can we learn about Barry Cox from that particular quote?
A lot.
Well, I think the first thing that's apparent in that quote is that he clearly sees himself in a very stereotypical male role.
Right. Yes, I thought that too, that he is the patriarch.
He's the dominant one.
If you looked at me as a delicate flower you had to nourish, I don't know how I'd feel about that.
Yeah, I can't see Lauren as a delicate flower. Well, if Lauren was a delicate flower, she might be a, what are those called? The flowers that eat people.
Really? That's where you're going? I am so not editing that out.
What are those flowers?
In other words, your wife is not a delicate flower. Little shop of horrors.
What's the name of the flower?
It's a Venus flytrap. I'm a Venus flytrap is what you're saying.
Right, which is to say strong, independent, and sometimes you even bite back.
Oh, you almost saved yourself.
I think that the delicate flower analogy shows that, well, number one,
How he sees women, how
Right.
he views women.
how he sees women. He sees women as weak. He sees women as dependent. He sees women as needing a man to water them and nurture them and have them grow. He sees them as apparently not mobile, apparently not independent, as stuck in one place. I think there's some misogynistic undertones to this.
You think?
A flower also dies without nurturing. A flower wilts, a flower fades, a flower needs attention. The male is the one providing that attention. The male is the one watering the flower. This is how he sees relationships. This is how he sees his wife,
Yes. She's no Venus flytrap.
right? And he sees this as a net positive.
Enough that he wrote it in a custody battle. That's how positive he looks at this.
I think we can also make some inferences about Janice at this point.
Janice is Lori's mother. She's married to Barry.
Steve Cope, in his custody filing, talked about Janice being obsessed with appearances, obsessed with weight and body image. That's an interesting observation because this suggests that Janice is very much falling into the cultural stereotype of
That delicate flower.
the delicate flower, the pretty blonde who tends to the male.
Whose job is to be beautiful. She's an object that he sees as his and not her own person.
Just based upon this rudimentary knowledge of Barry and Janice, their marriage falls into a category that I sometimes call the Tarzan Jane marriage. The Tarzan Jane marriage is one that has very clearly defined roles. The men and the women don't step out of those roles. There's not a lot of reciprocity. The man is in charge. The man dictates the rules. The man sets the tone in the household. One of the supposed advantages of this type of relationship is things are consistent, that the roles are known. For many couples, the Tarzan Jane marriage works perfectly fine. In fact, I'd say that most marriages have some version of these roles, and that's perfectly fine. I think the problem comes in when the roles become too rigid. In a very religious household, for example, like the Cox's household, you're expected to follow the party line. There's no deviation from stereotypical roles. There's no disloyalty towards the basic fundamental tenet that Tarzan does certain things, Jane does other things, and those are the way you're supposed to behave. And we actually see this in some of Alex Cox's comedy routine. There's racial stereotypes.
Alex Cox, again, he comes up a lot. He's Lori's older brother. He's now dead. He played a role in the children's death.
Here we see Alex playing on the idea of stereotypes that would be characteristic of narcissistic families with rigid worldviews, including racial stereotypes.
So while I was in jail, I also had a religious experience. I found Jesus. I found Jesus Ayala, Jesus Jimenez, and Jesus Garcia. They were all in my cell, and they all shared a bunk. I found out Christmas is wrong. Jesus was not born in Bethlehem. He was born in El Salvador. He was not a carpenter. He was a roofer, a tiler, and a landscaper.
This routine's interesting because I don't think Alex for 1 minute questions the inappropriateness of his jokes here. I think he just takes it for granted that this is how people see different cultures, that this is how people see the world. This is similar to Barry Cox in the sense that Barry Cox takes it for granted that women are flowers and that other races are inferior, or that perhaps the world has more complexity than they imagined. In these types of families, they're male dominated, they're patriarchal. There's probably a lot of expectations about following the rules. There's another irony here too about Barry Cox, because he's a very devout Mormon, apparently. My guess is that he's tithing, he's giving money to the church, which is the same concept as the IRS. It's just that he's choosing to give it to a different organization and have his money spent in a different way. So I think it's ironic that there's this hypocrisy about not wanting to support the United States, but being willing to support the Mormon church.
Right. And that's us guessing. We don't really know because a lot of the things that they claim to do as Mormons, they also didn't do. So I don't totally know that he was a tithe payer.
Whether he's tithing or not, I still think it's hypocritical in the sense that if he is tithing, he's giving his money to an organization without objection. And if he's not tithing, then he's not a devout Mormon.
I think hypocritical sums up the Cox family.
And inconsistent. There's some other interesting things we know about Barry Cox. We know that he was arrested and charged with soliciting a prostitute back in 94 or 95. That was also in Steve Cope's statement. We know that he walked into Steve Cope's place of employment and in front of a third party assaulted him.
Steve Cope was married to Stacy. This was during their custody battle. Melanie Pulowski is their daughter.
He pinned him up against the wall. He was charged with assault.
After he questioned Steve Cope's integrity, he then beat him up.
Well, even better yet, he read him scripture and then he beat him up. If you want to know Barry Cox, let me read that. This is from Steve Cope's filing with the court for a protection order against Barry Cox on August 8th, 1995. He says, Barry Cox visited my place of employment. He wanted to discuss the divorce proceedings between his daughter, Stacy, and myself. He'd been quoting me scripture and questioning my integrity. It seemed odd to me, since he was recently charged for solicitation of prostitution. Barry then claimed to show me divorce papers by ripping my shirt open and ramming 50 pages or more into my shirt. He then grabbed my shirt with his fists and shoved me against the wall. He had his fists and my shirt around my neck. My assistant called 911. Barry then left and was cited for assault and domestic violence.
And so there was a witness to this as well.
Yeah, there was a witness. So if you want to know Barry Cox, in addition to everything we've talked about, think about the notion of somebody walking into a public place where you work, quoting scripture, and then assaulting you. Think about the contradiction. Do you think this is someone who is a consistent parent? Do you think this is someone who is going to see his children for who they are? Do you think this is someone who's going to acknowledge his kids' individuality?
Do you think this is someone that would actually search for his missing grandkids? He hasn't said a word about his missing grandchildren, not even since their bodies were found buried in Chad Daybell's yard.
So now we're getting closer to this idea of narcissistic families. As children begin to become more autonomous, as they grow up, the parents, in this case, Barry and Janice, become more insistent upon having them reflect their needs, having them mirror their needs. They provide invalidating responses to them often. So in other words, when the child asks for something, the parent will often deny that. When the child discusses feeling something or thinking something, the parent will usually twist that to reflect something of their own needs. So the result of this is the emotional needs of the children become neglected. The children become vacuous. They become empty. Their selves become lost. If you become nothing more than a reflection of your parental image. Think of the myth of Narcissist again. He sees his image. But what if Narcissus looked into that pond and saw his parents and only his parents? Then he would become their reflection. That's what's going on in the Cox household.
Okay.
These children are becoming a reflection of their parental needs. They're not really becoming their own persons.
So in other words, their identities are based on their parents' needs.
Exactly. As a matter of survival and as a matter of getting their own needs met, they need to reflect back their parents' needs, their parents' desire to be seen in a certain way. And that's especially true when we're talking about a narcissist or a sociopath. And let me make it clear at this point too, this is speculation. This is based upon the best available evidence I have. It's based on facts we have. It's based on documents, but it's still speculation. I want to make that really clear. I am not diagnosing. I'm not diagnosing here. I'm simply saying this seems like a reasonable hypothesis. These seem like reasonable ideas, speculations, but this still is speculation. So that's a big caveat. More information may come out. We may learn a lot more about Barry and Janice and the Coxes as trial looms. So all of this is tentative. All of this can be adjusted down the road. And I want that to be clear. My analysis is based on what I know.
This case is ongoing. Information is ongoing.
As long as we're talking about diagnoses, another interesting tidbit that came out about Barry Cox was in Steve Cope's custody statement. He said that Stacy, the oldest daughter, had described that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And that's fascinating. And by the way, schizophrenia is not inconsistent with a personality disorder. You can be a narcissist and a schizophrenic. That would not be a pleasant combination.
No.
But you can be you can receive multiple diagnoses. So let's assume for the moment that there's some truth to that. I mean, I don't know. I'm just basing this on Steve's statement. But it's interesting to speculate his paranoia and some of his observations that seem at times completely untethered from reality might be schizophrenia. The only way I could actually diagnose these things, by the way, is if I were to get in and do some intense testing.
And met him
in person, if I did some interviews. Again, this is speculation, but it doesn't seem tremendously far-fetched.
And one thing John said when he was going over the documents when I walked in, he said, The only person that really seems to have a good grasp of what's going on is Steve Cope.
Right. Thanks, Steve.
Steve has stayed quiet throughout this entire ordeal with his daughter and ex-family, the Coxes. But Steve, we just want to give you a shout out if by chance you might ever listen. You've got a grasp on reality.
And I think Steve's custody affidavit was probably the most accurate and rational assessment of this family I've come across. I think there were tremendous insights into that, which is probably why he received custody of Melanie.
Yes, he did. At the end of this, he received custody. And then, of course, Melanie found her Cox family years later and was all of a sudden in a cult. And here we are today.
When you become a reflection of parental needs, what happens is that your thoughts and feelings are often buried, that you don't develop independent thoughts. You don't develop an autonomous identity, and you struggle to feel emotions because emotions are not validated in the home. One of the things I've seen a lot of, and this is consistent with some research, but not a lot, it's more based on clinical lore, is the idea that in narcissistic families, a lot of times the family members are indulged materially, but deprived emotionally. And on that note, I wanted to read another part of Barry Cox's statement. This is from Barry's response, August 14th, 1995, to Steve Cope's custody affidavit. Barry says, quote, "During the period of their marriage, I had taken Steve, Stacy, and Melanie on vacations to Texas and Las Vegas and have gone with them on vacations to Hawaii. I have often bought their airline tickets, rooms, food, and always whatever incidental expenses they have had. We have taken them with us to Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, the zoo, miniature golf, movies, water skiing, and out to horse farms. I always believed that we had a close and loving relationship until after Steve left Stacy." This statement by Barry is interesting to me on a number of levels. Number one, it shows quite clearly he values the material part.
Well, and that's what love is to him, right? Look what I do for them. I spend money on them.
But there's nothing in here at all of any type of emotional
Nurturing at all.
nurturing or emotional connection. There's nothing in here. Would you rather spend the day at Disneyland, or would you rather have some type of emotional nurturance from your parents?
I hope it's the latter. Maybe it's not from everyone else, but
Well, Barry Cox doesn't seem to think so. Barry Cox apparently thinks that Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm are sufficient substitutes from responsible parenting. You know, this is another area where we see this idea of a narcissistic family, where we see this idea of material things replacing the emotional needs.
well, and that's a lot about control as well. When you have a narcissistic family, you're going to be more loyal to the person buying you gifts. It's almost like an act of control. If you do what I say and stay in line, you will receive A, B, C, and D. And if you don't, and if you decide to divorce my daughter, then we will make your life a living hell.
And that's another feature of narcissistic families. There's something going on that family therapists call enmeshment. Enmeshment means there's no boundaries. It means that the family members don't know where one person begins and the other ends, that there's just a lot of confusion and chaos and identity diffusion and a lack of boundaries. We'll talk about this more when we talk about some of the sexual problems in this family. But
Stay tuned.
when parental needs become of paramount importance and the self gets lost, there's another interesting thing that happens. That is usually at some point when the child recognizes that in some ways they've sacrificed themselves to their parents. A lot of times anger starts to seep in. You'll start seeing a little bit of acting out. You'll start seeing angry outbursts. You'll start seeing some anger. And now we're getting closer to Lori,
Okay.
right? This is Lori's forte. If you look at some of the court documents, one specifically by Cheryl Wheeler.
Cheryl Wheeler is Charles Vallow's ex-wife. So Charles Vallow was married to Lori Vallow for nearly 15 years before he was murdered. Before he was married to Lori, he was married to Cheryl Wheeler and had 2 sons. That's who Cheryl Wheeler is.
So Cheryl, in a court document filed to try to get custody of her kids
And take them out of the Vallow household.
and take them out of the Vallow household, Cheryl talks about the dramatic fights that would occur between Charles and Lori. She talked about just these crazy, massive spectacles. In one case, she talked about Charles was driving the car and Lori reached over and kept grabbing his arm and tried to pull him off the steering wheel, that one of her kids thought that the car was going to crash. The child was afraid for their life. They were screaming at each other. You see this incredible anger and rage that Lori has. It's not hard to imagine this.
Knowing her father and her family.
So that's another element of a narcissistic family. When the self becomes displaced by parental needs, the self still wants to find some type of validation, some type of recognition. That's a major part of Lori's personality, is this attention-seeking part. She's in beauty pageants.
Which is also what her parents want her to be.
She fits kind of the classic female stereotype, but she just can't stop getting enough attention.
It's never enough. Is that why she's had 5 marriages?
That would speak to her intimacy problems, which is a characteristic of narcissistic families. Because the self is so buried behind the parents' needs, because the self is empty, there becomes a tremendous need for external validation. And what I mean by that is, in the absence of a self with any substance, the self will naturally fill in the void with outside influences. And in the case of Lori, it's clear what that is. It's religion. And that's true for this entire family, for the most part, that religion was the one element that filled the void. This is particularly interesting to consider with Lori, because Lori seems to me to be a person who needs religion as a substitute for a conscience.
You're actually answering one of our listeners' questions right now. She left this on Facebook. They wonder how all the religiousness fits in with Lori's narcissism. Narcissism being her term. And there you go.
Religion becomes the mechanism through which the loss of self, the void of the self, can be filled. In the absence of an inner self or an inner world, we're going to fill that void, or Lori will fill that void with outside influences. In her case, that would be men, that would be religion, that might be sex, that would be money, material possessions.
Chad Daybell.
Chad Daybell.
The irresistible nature of Chad Daybell. Will we talk about that later? Why the attraction to Chad Daybell?
I think we're getting close to it now.
Okay. All of us want to know, what in the world did she see in Chad Daybell?
I don't think she saw the beauty of Narcissus. I think she saw someone who proclaimed himself to be a prophet. And I think that was sufficient.
That was all she needed.
The notion that someone who lacked any sense of power as a child, because she grew up with such a dominant father, is someone who at some level would be seeking omnipotence. And I think Chad Daybell offered her that vision of omnipotence. When he offered to bring her on as his partner in the New Jerusalem and he anointed her a goddess, I think that was so compelling to her.
A gatherer of the 144,000.
Right. Well, not just a gatherer, his partner.
Right.
Right. This obviously didn't have anything to do with physical appearances. This had to do with the promise of something that she longed for, which was connection to a God and connection to omnipotence. Her father probably offered some of that, but it was always hollow.
Well, she would have never been a partner with her dad either.
Right, exactly. In fact, probably the biggest defense mechanism you'll see in sociopaths is the need for omnipotent control. That's also true of borderline personality disorder too. The biggest defense mechanism is omnipotent control. And the reason that's a defense mechanism is because omnipotent control allows us to feel power that we don't normally feel, that we seek to control the world, to manipulate the world, to get what we want when we know deep down that it's a fiction. So
Okay.
Chad
You think she knew deep down it was a fiction?
I think she felt empty. I think she felt weak. I think she felt vulnerable. I think we all feel that. I think she felt shame. I think she was covering all that up with her deeply religious beliefs and her materialism and her beauty queen stuff. She was seeking to assert herself in a way that made her feel important and special and omnipotent. And Chad Daybell, more than anything else, that's what Chad Daybell offered her. He offered her immortality and omnipotence.
Okay. And not the best looking package.
This whole situation actually reminds me a good deal of the French play Cyrano de Bergerac, written in 1897. The story is about a French nobleman who has an unusually large nose. Because of that, he's concerned that he will never find love, that no woman would be capable of loving him. So he woos his prospective love interest, Roxanne, through poetry and music and language in general. I think this current situation with Chad is actually, if Cyrano de Bergerac was Mormon and lived today, and he was a doomsday prepper who wrote a good deal of fiction about the post-apocalyptic world, that would be Chad Daybell.
So would Chad's version of poetry then be his pickup line, hey, we were married in past lives?
Probations.
Right, probations. Got to get the terminology right. And it's not reincarnation, it's probations.
Right. And how bizarre is that? How would you like to be in a probation?
If Chad told me that, I'd probably punch him, not want to then have an affair with him. But also, so, and let's talk about that. What about her materialism? You know, she lived in this fancy house. She dated, by all accounts, good looking men. She cared about those things. Are you saying that really all he needed to do was woo her with doomsday preaching and past probations?
Quick observation, by the way, the punching part, that's the Venus flytrap. I would say never underestimate the power of fantasy. Remember that Lori encountered Chad's writings as early as 215, maybe earlier, and she became a huge fan of his, which meant she had a tremendous amount of time to develop fantasies about who this person was and how important he was and what a deity he was. When I think about the role and influence of fantasy in people's lives, it's just enormous. I think in this case, Cyrano de Bergerac was able to divert attention away from his looks through his words. I think something similar is happening here, that Lori was able to create this immense fantasy of someone who was a god or godlike, and that really appealed to her. Another element of narcissistic families is what the Pressmans call intimacy deficits. That should be no surprise. When you grow up in a narcissistic family, you struggle to develop lasting relationships because you've grown up essentially in the shadow of a dominant parent, in this case, Barry Cox. You probably have an insecure attachment because you haven't received the normal validating responses that children should receive from their parents, validating their emotions, validating their thoughts, validating their interests and their independence. As an aside, there's a well-known researcher at the University of Washington. His name is John Gottman. Gottman did a study in the late 90s where he looked at the healthiest children, and he found that the healthiest families engaged in what he called emotion coaching.
So what exactly is emotion coaching?
Emotion coaching is when the parents assist their children in understanding emotions. It's that simple. To get more specific, Gottman defines it as the process of assisting children to identify, acknowledge, and express emotions.
So that definitely didn't happen in the Cox household.
Did they have emotions besides anger?
Well, I think they would even pretend they didn't have anger.
True.
All was well in the Cox household. Look the other way, so they say.
Gottman essentially found that the healthiest kids, in terms of school adjustment, the widest social networks, the best grades, the most successful students, came from emotion coaching families. In the Cox family, it doesn't seem like there was any emotion coaching. In that sense, most of these kids probably had insecure attachments. We talked about attachment in our second episode.
Episode 2.
I'd refer you back to episode 2, and maybe if you want more details on attachment, please go revisit that. I don't think it's unusual that both Chad and Lori were insecurely attached. The Pressmans point out these families often have very little trust. The children at some level don't trust the parents because they know the parents are dominating. They know that they're tending to their parents' needs.
And they're going to also learn how to manipulate their parents. Is this where Lori got her manipulation skills? Melanie Gibbs spoke of Lori's anger. Others have as well. We've heard her get angry on the phone during that recorded call with Melanie Gibb.
Is there a witness when Jesus, Heavenly Father, gave that to Joseph Smith by himself in the grove? Was there a witness?
No, but they had it later with other people.
Yes or no?
I'm sorry?
Is that in the scriptures? Yes or no? Never had any idea that you would be the person of all people to turn me. I cannot
I
believe
am
it.
asking questions.
Wait, it's not what we're talking about here. That's what I'm saying. You are going off the deep end.
Yeah, the manipulation is a function of attempting to feel loved.
Hmm.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because manipulation serves different functions for different types of personality disorders. In fact, in the DSM, the differential diagnosis between a borderline personality and an antisocial personality is power. A sociopath will manipulate to get his or her way, to get power, whereas a borderline personality disorder will manipulate to get their emotional needs met. And it's not clear to me which or both apply.
Could
in the
both
case of
apply?
Lori.
Is that a possibility? Could both apply?
You can have multiple personality disorder diagnoses.
Really? I am learning this for the first time. Dun, dun, dun. So, yes, it's possible. Well, that makes me think she was both. And I can say that because I'm not the psychologist who has to worry about diagnosing someone. I'm going to say Lauren's opinion only. Perhaps she was both.
Let's dig a little deeper into the Cox family. I want to get back to this idea of seeing better. I think it's interesting to imagine that Janice, who was obsessed with appearances, never really saw Lori. What she saw was a daughter who appeared to be pretty and slender and basically fit the stereotypical feminine role that Janice always wanted in a daughter.
Listen to what Janice said in an interview with CBS when her 2 grandchildren were missing and nobody knew where they were.
I know the truth about Lori. I know how loving she is. I did not see any great change in Lori, and she couldn't crack enough to do harm to her children. I've never seen anyone who put their whole life and soul into a child like she did with each one of those kids.
Making a statement like that is totally consistent with a narcissistic family in the sense that what she perceives to be the person she knows is actually nothing more than an extension of herself. What she's saying is she thinks she knows someone that's like her, but she doesn't really know who her daughter is because she never cared to look.
Not to mention in the same interview, she then says or claims that she spoke to JJ on the phone. October, we know now he was dead by then. She was straight out lying.
That type of line is consistent with a narcissistic family also in the sense that these families are enmeshed and they'll do anything to cover for each other. They will lie. They will violate the boundaries of others. They will cover up. They will do whatever it takes to protect their children if that's what it takes, because their children are often extensions of themselves. And so in some ways, they don't see this as a lie. They see this as just normal business. This is the normal business of a narcissistic family protecting itself.
Lying to hide family secrets.
Right, exactly. Covering up secrets, burying secrets, closing ranks to the world so that others can't see them for who they are.
And listen to what she says about her son Alex in this same interview. We already know at the time of the interview that Alex spent time in prison for assaulting Lori's husband, Joe Ryan, and that he shot and killed Lori's husband, Charles VALLOW, just months prior. Now we know Alex's phone pinged on Chad Daybell's property during the time law enforcement believed the children were being buried. So how does Alex's mom describe him? Listen to this.
Alex is the most laid back person. He's been funny his whole life. He was very protective of Colby and Tylee. Very protective. He's always owned up to anything he's done wrong. He certainly wasn't perfect, but he doesn't have the intensity of a hitman. He doesn't have the desire to be hit. He doesn't think that death solves anything.
So when you listen to Janice talk about her son, Alex Cox, do you think she has a good grasp of her son outside of her narrowly defined expectations for him? Or do you think that he's a reflection of what she wants to see? And I think that's also true of Tylee. I don't think Lori ever saw Tylee. I think Lori saw Tylee as someone who didn't fit the stereotype, and that she kept trying to push Tylee back into that mold. And I think that was probably a big part of some of their conflicts.
I can't imagine being Tylee, who from all accounts and from what I've seen and read was smart, thoughtful, fun, had so much inside of her, trying to please her mother. And we have documents that show that there was great concern for Tylee's welfare in this family. Tylee's friend's mother has said that she saw Lori body shame Tylee. With all that Tylee had going for her, to hear that on her Pinterest account, half of it was diet stuff is heartbreaking to me. It goes to show that they really didn't see her for who she was.
Right. And that Tylee was also following this narcissistic familial trend towards meeting her mother's needs and not hers. That she too was becoming a reflection of Lori and not herself. That Lori wasn't giving her the freedom to grow and become her own person.
And she was trying so hard, from all accounts. She was trying so hard to be her own person.
That gives me a good segue to talk about Stacy. Stacy was the oldest. Stacy was a type 1 diabetic.
Lori's oldest sister.
She passed away at age 31 in 1998, I believe. Stacy, too, had a number of health problems. Steve Cope brought this up in his custody paperwork. He talked about how she refused to take her insulin. She refused to eat sugar. She believed that germs were infecting everything. Janice denied in 1995, when Stacy was 67 pounds, that she was anorexic. Janice denied that there were any emotional issues with Stacy whatsoever, in spite of the fact that multiple doctors that Steve named in the paperwork all agreed she needed serious psychiatric help. They all agreed that she was anorexic. They all agreed that this was a problem, but not the Coxes.
Janice said in the Steve Cope documents, and this is Janice writing now, Steve agreed with me on the phone that all of Stacy's problems had a physiological basis associated with her diabetes and were not emotionally induced.
Janice was heavily invested in the idea that her daughter's problems had no emotional component, which also would be consistent with a narcissistic family's inability to face the fact that most of their problems are emotional. When Stacy was struggling and weighed 67 pounds, and Janice and Barry were denying that anorexia had anything to do with it, they actually made a comment. Steve had talked to Stacy, and she told them this.
This is Steve writing about a conversation he had with Stacy. She called me on the telephone, and she said words to the effect of, Steve, I have done everything that I can. I've talked to Barry and Janice, her parents, and we all agree it is my time to go.
Imagine that your daughter has anorexia and your son-in-law is sounding the alarm on this. He's telling you that she's not taking insulin because she has diabetes too, that she's not eating properly, that she's doing everything she can to avoid taking care of her health. So in addition to the diabetes, she's clearly anorexic. She clearly has a massive eating disorder that she's denying. And you go to the family and the family says, well, too bad, time to go.
They would rather say it was likely her time to go or God's plan that she go now than to admit that she has an eating disorder.
That she has an emotional issue.
That scares them more than her passing away.
Now that I've spent about 50 minutes leading up to this moment, here's the point I want to make. Here's my theme for today. And that is, wait for it, that Stacy's tragic situation is actually the metaphor for the Cox family, which is, while her body was starving for food and nourishment, I would argue even more strongly and tragically that what she was really starving for was emotional nourishment. I think that's what was lacking in the Cox family. This is really all about emotional nourishment, and it's about being seen and acknowledged
and heard
for who you are as a child growing up. That Lori, like her sister Stacy, I don't know if Lori had any eating disorders. I think it's probable. We don't know for sure based on what we know about this case, but there's no question in my mind that Lori too struggled with emotional nourishment. Alex Cox struggled with emotional nourishment. The underlying theme is in narcissistic families, parents predominate, their needs predominate, children are secondary, they don't get their emotional needs met, they're starving emotionally, they just want some attention, they lose their sense of self, they typically turn to outside sources for validation, such as religion or extreme religious beliefs. They struggle to form intimate relationships. And in the end, they come up empty.
In the end, they steal their dead sister's credit card. That's what Alex Cox did when Stacy died. He was found using his dead sister's credit card.
How does this apply to Alex, by the way? Well, for one thing, we know that he didn't have any significant relationships until he married Zulema at the end.
Which we question.
Dubious in terms of why he married her.
Right.
I guess we don't know the motivation, but it hardly seems like it was based on mutual affection.
Right. Zulema and Alex got married 2 weeks before Alex's death. On the 911 call, Zulema's son referred to Alex as his mom's boyfriend.
Older male here named Alex. He just passed out here on my bathroom.
Okay. Do you know him?
No, it's my mother's boyfriend.
Alex's last name?
I don't know.
You don't know his name?
No.
So even her own son didn't even know that she'd married him. And clearly the Coxes didn't know either. Here's Janice.
It was hard to hear about Alex from the police. We didn't know he'd gotten married. We didn't know he'd moved back to Arizona.
Also, their wedding officiator in Las Vegas has spoken up and said that the two seemed non-emotional about the entire affair. So really, Alex's only significant relationship is a total mystery.
Weren't you saying that Zulema had been married multiple times before?
Yeah, I think 7, 6, maybe 8, 6, 7, 8, around there. She was an energy healer who was part of the cult. It was Alex's first marriage, and not even his family knew.
We know that Alex took a number of trips to South America to meet Latina women. And also in one of Alex's comedy routines, he jokes about assaulting Joe Ryan as if that's material for a comedy routine.
Joe Ryan is Tylee's biological father.
Not only does he joke about it, he clearly doesn't grasp that he did anything wrong.
You ever had something that you knew was the right thing to do, but it turns out that later on it was a felony? This is a true story. I found out that my ex-brother-in-law was a pedophile, so I took a stun gun and I discharged it right in his nutsack. And in Texas, that's a felony. I'm thinking, maybe I'll get a handshake or a parade or something. I got probation.
So apparently Alex Cox thinks that assault is funny, which is ironic because his father, Barry, who had earlier assaulted Steve, also seems to think that assault is perfectly acceptable or even maybe humorous.
I can't help but laugh. Alex is the most laid back person. He said, I tasered a pedophile. And so he said, I'm willing to admit it.
This obviously is a family that doesn't see a problem with violence. They're self-righteous. They take the moral high ground. And within all of that, you have multiple instances of violence and assault, consistent with our theme of Barry being a dominant figure and antisocial and grandiose. We see similar qualities in Alex, undoubtedly.
A lot of people have been asking if you think that Lori was sexually abused.
I think we're going to have to save that for next week.
Is dinner coming to an end?
I think our dinner's coming to an end. I want to return to the story of Narcissus, and I want to talk about the other part of that story that's often neglected, and that's the story of Echo. Echo, who followed Narcissus everywhere, had no ability to speak. So the name Echo is suggestive of that Echo could only parrot back words from other people. Echo loved Narcissus. She wanted nothing more than to have Narcissus tell her that he loved her. And one day he did that. And she parroted back the words, I love you, hoping that he would hear and he would acknowledge her. But Narcissus did not hear. Her words fell on deaf ears and she died of unrequited love. And I think when you add in Echo to the story, it becomes a beautiful metaphor for the children of narcissistic families. The children are like Echo. They just want to be heard. They have no voice. They parrot back their parents' words. They just want to be heard, but they're not. And when they're not heard, they too can die of unrequited love. All they want is love. Let me tell a story about an inmate I was evaluating a couple of years ago. This inmate was on death row. I was asked to evaluate him because the courts wanted to know whether the death penalty should apply or whether he should just get life in prison. 2 weeks before I was assigned this evaluation from the courts, this inmate had attempted to kill the previous evaluator. He took his pen and he shoved it into his jugular and he almost killed him, except for the fact that one of the guards came in and stopped him. But the psychologist was harmed. He was hospitalized. They reassigned another evaluator which was me. The courts sent me a number of letters letting me know the risks, and I decided to do it because I felt like I could. They wanted someone else to take a look at them. They sent me in 6 months later. I had multiple guards standing outside of the room. I did something in this evaluation with this death row inmate that I've never done before. And that is every visitation room in every prison or jail has what's known as a panic button. So right by the door is a button that if there's an emergency, the evaluator or the visitor will press that and somebody will come in immediately, especially if there's a guard stationed outside, which isn't always the case. I decided in this situation, I was going to send a message of trust right away. And the best way I can think of doing that was to sit on the opposite end of the table from the panic button. So when they brought the inmate in, I was already in the room. I was sitting on the other end of the table away from the panic button, and he was seated next to the panic button. That's the only time I've ever done that. I believe it had a really significant impact because he came in, he knew immediately what was happening, and I think it put him at ease. We both knew during that evaluation that the outcome was going to be a negative one. We both knew that his options were best case, life in prison. I ended up listening to him very deeply. I ended up paying attention to him at a very profound level. I don't think I did a tremendous amount of talking during that interview, but there was a lot of crying. I remember he spent the last hour and a half in tears talking about his childhood, talking about things he had never talked about with anyone else. 3 months later, I received a letter from this inmate thanking me for listening, thanking me for being the one person, including family, that he could reveal his story to, that he had never done that before, and that he felt better, even though he knew he was going to die in prison, and he felt more complete. The moral of this story is that he's Echo, and I'm listening profoundly. It doesn't matter what he's done. As a human being, I still have an obligation to listen to that story as best I can and to try to understand him as best I can, even though we both know the outcome's going to be negative. This also brings me back to my lead today about seeing better. I want to end today with the idea that there's a lot of echoes in the world. There's a lot of people that don't feel like they're being seen or heard. And that if somehow we can take the time to see just a little better and to hear a little more deeply someone's story and their pain, that we can probably avoid a lot of future problems. I really feel like if Chad and Lori had seen a little better, and if they had heard a little more clearly, and if they as children had been seen better, and if they as children had been listened to more deeply, that you and I wouldn't be doing this podcast.
Right.
We would have nothing to say because they would be different people and they wouldn't have done what they did. And JJ and Tylee would still be here with us today, and we could have avoided this entire tragedy. And so my aspiration is let's all try to take a little bit of time to see a little better and to hear a little more deeply, and maybe that can change someone for the better, that will resonate for generations and generations to come.
We still have a lot more to say about Lori Vallow. In fact, we received a lot of questions tonight, and there were some questions that we planned on answering tonight that we did not.
This is the beginning. I just wanted to introduce the idea of narcissistic families and to kind of set the tone for what's to follow. There's so many areas we need to cover with Lori. Next week, we're going to be looking more deeply at personality disorders and how they apply to Lori, or if they apply to Lori. And then in another episode, we're going to look at some of the elements that came together for her to get to the point where she was able to murder her kids.
Which is what everyone is grasping to understand or make sense of. How could a mother murder her kids?
We're pointing out a few elements now. There's a lack of empathy. There's a lack of emotional connection. There's a willingness to sacrifice everything for this feeling of omnipotence. We're going to be talking about the idea of terrorism and how it applies here. There's a lot of paths we're going to go down.
Setting the foundation.
We're setting the foundation with the narcissistic family.
I want to thank April Parker for helping us get some of those documents, specifically the custody battle between Steve and Stacy Cope. April runs the Facebook group Find Justice, Tylee and JJ. We also want to thank Annie Cushing, Tylee Ryan's aunt, for her relentless pursuit of information that has also helped us. And we want to thank all of you for sharing this podcast with all of your friends. We had 10,000 downloads. this last week. We're so grateful for all of you who are sharing with your friends and leaving us reviews. We want to be able to keep doing this, so thank you.
We're really energized by all the positive feedback, and we're very grateful and humbled.
If you haven't yet, like our Facebook page, Hidden a True Crime Podcast, and our Instagram page at Hidden True Crime. We actually have a YouTube channel now, Hidden True Crime, so you can go follow us on that channel. We'll post the podcast there as well as some other videos soon.
So as always, I want to say, stay safe, wear a helmet, please try not to fall into a portal.
And if you're ever questioning whether someone you're hanging out with could possibly be Satan, but maybe not, listen to that thought.
If you have a moment of self-reflection where you think you're being deceived by Satan, you probably are being deceived by Satan.
Go with that.
Yeah, go with your gut on that one.
Until next time.
We'll keep a seat open for you for next week. Good night.
Good night. Hey everyone, we're going to keep streaming here, so stay with us. In fact, I have the next episode ready to go. I'm going to just swap over to that. And then I do see, though, that this episode is the next episode. Oh, hold on. Stop. 1 second. All right. So the next episode that we're about to listen to, I'm reading it here on the screen. Beyond the Veil, The Many Extremes of Lori Vallow Daybell, Part 1. I just realized that it's Part 1. We're going to keep going, but I'm going to check time and see if it's possible for us to maybe even play Part 2 after that. So again, these are all grouped. They go really well together. I'm going to have to pick up my son here in a couple hours. Maybe Dr. John could go get him. So we're going to at least play one other episode. We might play 2. So let your friends know we're here. I love this group, and it's helpful for me to revisit as we prepare for Lori Vallow sentencing. And again, I don't want us to forget Chad's trial next year, because it is equally important, just as important. And we're still here for justice. So let's get this next episode going. So we'll play at least one more episode, maybe 2. I'll check the times and let you guys know in chat. If you want to join chat, again, as always, hit subscribe, and that will help. And yes, did you see at the end there too? It said we now have a YouTube channel. Surprise! Here we are, 3 years later. That was our first YouTube video, I believe, that podcast episode, and this is our second. Hidden, a true crime podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way.
I'm just saying, this is not a behavior of someone that sees Jesus Christ. It's not the behavior.
Really? Have you ever seen Jesus Christ? So do you know what the future behavior would be if you had seen Jesus Christ?
I know that when I pray.
Lord asks me to do every day, and He does protect me, and He is protecting me, and He will protect me against this accusation as well. And we will both stand there with Him, and you tell me if I was lying or not. But we're both standing there with Jesus Christ.
Okay.
This is Lauren Matthias.
And I'm Dr. John Matthias.
And what you just heard was the recorded phone call between Melanie Gibb, Lori, and Chad. Melanie and Lori arguing over how you would act if you saw Jesus Christ, because Lori has seen Jesus Christ, according to Lori.
And that will lead us into our theme for this podcast, which is extremism.
But before we begin, we just want to thank everyone again for the positive reviews you've left us, as well as sharing with your friends this podcast. It means so much, and we hope that you will keep sharing and keep letting us know your thoughts. We love to hear from you.
I also want to mention one of our listeners who wrote a comment about our podcast, Allison Christensen. Allison left a comment about the ending of our last podcast that meant a lot to me, and I'd like Lauren to read that.
It says, the advice at the end of this episode made me go about my day differently with my kids, and it always will. Thank you both for this most excellent podcast.
When we started this podcast, I told Lauren that I really wanted this podcast to be about more than just crime. Of course, we're going to talk about crime or crimes in depth, but my hope was to use crime as a platform to dig deeper into the human condition. And so when I hear Allison say that, I feel a tremendous sense of gratitude. It means a lot to me that one of our listeners was impacted enough by the ending of our podcast to take action in the world with their kids. I think that if we were to conclude this podcast today, my goal would have been accomplished in changing someone's life for the better, or at least how they interact with their children for the better. I think I'd also like to look ahead a little bit. We're in episode 8, and we probably anticipate concluding our first season Beyond the Veil after 12 episodes. We are starting to look forward to season 2. We don't have a particular case in mind to cover at the moment.
What have people suggested? You guys have actually written us some ideas.
The Rodin family murder was one. The Menendez brothers. There was a case that Lauren and I talked about at the beginning with Adam Dees.
And Israel Keys. Oh, they rhyme.
We would love to hear from you guys about cases you'd like us to cover in the future. We're going to do some single episodes too. One of those, I want to talk about the appeal of serial killers to women and why some women pursue and marry serial killers in jail. Another single episode that we'll be doing will be about the allure of crime to listeners. And in that episode, I think it'll be very personal because I would like to talk about how I became so fascinated with crime myself. So if you have any thoughts about future episodes you would like us to cover or crimes you would like us to cover, please go to our Facebook page and let us know.
And that Facebook page is Hidden, a True Crime Podcast, or facebook.com/Hidden True Crime. A lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, including an email posted on Reddit that we're about to discuss, will be posted on this Facebook page. So if there's ever more information you want or additional resources you're looking for, always check our Facebook page and we will post there. You can also follow us on Instagram at Hidden True Crime and Twitter at Hidden Crime. Back to Melanie and Lori arguing about how one should act when Jesus Christ is around. Lori believes firmly that she has seen Jesus Christ, and she makes that very clear here.
And I will never deny it. For my soul would be at stake if I did. So you can say it didn't happen to me, Mel, but if I say it, then I am accountable. You didn't witness it, but I did.
Not only that, she believes that Jesus Christ officiated their wedding.
Yes, she does. Let's go back a little bit. We need to discuss something that was posted on Reddit back in January. This was when the children were missing and the world was only beginning to learn about this bizarre case. So an anonymous someone, posted an email that they claimed was sent to them by a friend of Chad's. They posted it to Reddit so that everyone could be, quote, aware of what was going on, end quote. Back then, no one researching the case could take the email seriously and believe it was real because it spoke of, portals and zombies and murders and scriptures used to justify the murders. Well, throughout the months, we've seen everything that this email has stated has been accurate so far. I'll post that email on our Facebook page so you can go check it out. There's one part of this email, and it's clear to us this is what Melanie and Lori are arguing over. It's Jesus Christ officiating at Lori and Chad's supposed first wedding, a wedding while they were still married to their other spouses.
I'm thinking, wow, how did they get Jesus Christ to officiate their wedding?
True. You and I got Janice, a woman named Janice, to officiate ours.
Janice was an accountant who had a moonlighting gig as a wedding officiant.
And we're just lucky that the day before our wedding, we found her on Thumbtack. If we had a couple more days, maybe
we could have found Jesus Christ.
We could have held out for Jesus to answer our Thumbtack request.
Maybe we just had the wrong connections. Maybe we should have been in contact with Chad.
We've always been very grateful for Janice, who officiated our elopement, a real elopement where we decided the day before to get married.
Yeah, she was great. Do you need Jesus to officiate your wedding? I guess it validates your status as a deity. I guess that's what they're looking for.
This is a longer email than I thought. I'm trying to find that line about Jesus Christ being at their wedding. And actually, it wasn't Jesus Christ that married them. It was Jesus Christ who was witness. So he just came as a guest. He didn't even have anything else to do except just be there.
Yeah, but he guaranteed the status of their marriage.
That's true.
By being present.
A witness does do that. In the Mormon faith, a witness is actually a very important person in a wedding. It is to witness and confirm that it is official.
So when you say that Jesus is present at your wedding, you're obviously making a self-important statement about how significant you are, how holy and significant your marriage is.
So this email states that in November of 2018, together at this point, Chad and Lori, while their other spouses are alive and well and they're married to other spouses, that they went and were sealed to each other in a temple where they traveled into another upper room, and Moroni gave Lori to Chad. The Savior was there. Being sealed to each other in the temple means marriage. Sealed means you are sealed for eternity in LDS lingo. Moroni is a prophet in the Book of Mormon, and it says that he gave Lori to Chad, and the Savior was there.
Never mind that they're probably both married to and sealed to their other spouses at this point.
But that didn't stop them from finding a secret room in the temple and performing their own secret illegal wedding, which also talk about hypocritical. They're using religion to justify their sins.
To me, this is just confirmation of how extreme they were and the lengths to which they would go to show how important and special they were. And we'll be talking about those ideas throughout this podcast.
We do want to say that this episode will have discussions about sexuality and sexual abuse.
So let's pick up where we left off last week. We were talking about Lori, VALLOW, DAYBELL, and the idea of the empty self. Psychologists sometimes also refer to that as the false self. I think today I'm going to switch over and start using the term false self because I think it's probably a more accurate description. What the false self is, as I explained last time, is essentially a self that is a reflection of parental needs. It's a self that's formed in the absence of the parent's inability to reflect back the child's own emotions and thoughts.
Would it be like not having your own personality or knowing who you are?
Yeah, I think the personality would be another accurate description of the self. So it's a personality that becomes a reflection of parental needs rather than a composite of that person's actual interests and that person's needs.
Wow. It's kind of hard to take that in when you have always known who you are, to realize that some people just simply don't.
One thing we didn't bring up last time that I think is important is in the custody paperwork that Steve Cope filed, he also mentions that Melanie Pulowski
is Lori Vallow's niece, the daughter of Steve Cope, and her mother, Stacy. Stacy is Lori's older sister, now deceased. Steve Cope gained custody of Melanie, and Melanie, though later found her way back into the Cox family's life and became part of this cult from what we can tell.
Here's a quote from Steve in the custody affidavit. Here's what Steve says about Melanie.
At this time, Melanie is only 6 years old.
Melanie has become the caretaker for her mother, believing that she is responsible for her mother. The effect is that in her mother's presence and given her mother's demands, Melanie sacrifices her own childhood to caring for her mother. This is precisely the family dynamic that we discussed last week. And this is exactly the family dynamic that leads to the creation of a false self. So here, Stacy, who's anorexic and also diabetic, a type 1 diabetic, is letting her daughter tend to her needs. Admittedly, she's very sick, but typically in that situation, you would find healthcare workers or friends or other people to meet your needs and to assist you rather than your daughter. What Stacy's doing here, and Stacy is the eldest daughter in the Cox family, is she's leaning on Melanie for emotional and intellectual and psychological support. It's so blatant that Steve notices this and goes so far as to report this to the courts as something that he believes is unacceptable for her normal development. What's interesting about this dynamic to me is the fact that now you see this pattern repeating through the generations.
Right.
Here we have the granddaughter of Barry and Janice now becoming the caretaker, just as their kids were their caretakers at some level because Barry was so dominant. Now you have Melanie repeating this pattern. In fact, one of our listeners asked the question, to what degree is this genetic? And the answer is, for personality disorders such as narcissistic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, which we'll get to in a little bit, there is definitely a genetic component.
There's definitely a nurture and nature component to it.
Right. In families like this, it's not just the emotional component that's allowing this to repeat through the generations. It's also probably some genetic biological component that's being passed down that has to do with temperament and personality and things that are a little more enduring. One thing I want to mention too that I didn't mention last week that I think is important is there's a brilliant British psychoanalyst by the name of D.W. Winnicott who wrote a lot about children. He talked about the idea of a good enough parent. And the idea of a good enough parent is that a parent does not have to perfectly meet the needs of the children to have healthy, high-functioning kids. A parent simply needs to be good enough. In other words, there's a lot of room for error. So I don't want you guys to think that this is about perfection and this is about tending to every single little need of the child. It's not. What I'm talking about here is something much more extreme. What I talked about last week with the idea of a narcissistic family is we're looking at an outlier. We're looking at something that's extreme. We're looking at very extreme beliefs, religious beliefs. We're looking at extreme political views in terms of abolishing the IRS. We're looking at something that's atypical.
Right.
Hopefully, most of us, Lauren and myself included, we try to be good enough parents. And so we recognize that if we get out on the extremes, that could be a problem. And the Cox family is out on those extremes a lot without recognizing it.
And for future reference, when we talk about their religious beliefs or their political beliefs, we're always talking about extremes.
And this brings us into the heart of our topic today, which is how does one move from a false self into a personality disorder? And the answer to that is, in the absence of an authentic self, which would be the opposite of the false self, or a true self, as we sometimes call it, in the absence of a true authentic self, will fill the void oftentimes with extreme behaviors.
Are these the extreme behaviors that would translate into somebody being diagnosed with, like, say, a personality disorder?
Yeah, that's a question that so many people have been asking me. What is Lori's diagnosis? Or does Lori have a personality disorder? And I mentioned last time that I'm trying to stay away from diagnosing because it's a bit of a taboo subject with psychologists and psychiatrists, because there's something called the Goldwater Rule, which was adopted in 1973 by the American Psychiatric Association, which essentially says in order for a psychologist or psychiatrist to diagnose, we need to do an in-depth interview and maybe some testing. Typically, the ethical thing to do is to have sufficient information on someone to provide the appropriate diagnosis. In this world, though, 1973 was a long time ago. In
before
the world,
reality television.
And before doxing.
Before doxing, before live videos on social media.
Right. Nowadays we have access to such tremendous information that a lot of people have moved away from this rule and feel much more comfortable providing diagnoses. Fortunately, in our case, I have, in the psychosexual evaluation that was performed in 2007 on Joe Ryan.
That would be Lori Vallow's ex-husband, Tylee Ryan's father, who is now deceased. He died in 2018.
In this evaluation, the evaluator says of Lori, who she interviewed, she says to rule out histrionic and borderline issues. Now, she's not exactly diagnosing, but she's getting us close enough that I can run with that. So
she's speculating that Lori has either histrionic or borderline or some sort of.
Right. She's saying that she probably has one or the other of these diagnoses, And if she doesn't, you need to rule it out. In other words, she's ruling it in. She's asking another mental health professional to rule it out. So, as another mental health professional looking at this report and observing Lori's behaviors, I am not going to rule those out.
There we go. It's a
In
good way to
fact-
put it.
In fact, I'm going to piggyback on these diagnoses. I'm going to concur with the evaluator, whose name, out of respect, I won't mention, but I'm going to concur that I believe this is a very accurate interpretation of Lori's situation, that I think histrionic and or borderline personality disorder are probably, well, and narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder are probably all pretty close in terms of providing an accurate diagnosis. And as I explained last week, each one of these diagnoses falls into cluster B in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So there's a lot of overlap between them. In fact, I want to read you guys a page from the DSM, as we call it, that has to do with personality disorders, so that we're clear about this. And because I know that some mental health professionals out there listening to this might give me a little bit of pushback here. This is on page 666.
Oh,
Think
great.
about the irony of that.
Yeah, even the DSM is in on this.
666 pertaining to Lori VALLOW Daybell, who Melanie Gibb called Korihor, which is the Mormon term for the devil. On page 666, here it is. If an individual has personality features that meet criteria for one or more personality disorders, in addition to borderline personality disorder, all can be diagnosed. So there you have it.
Huh.
We can say, according to the DSM, that Lori, who, by the way, meets almost all the conditions of histrionic personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, and maybe to a lesser degree antisocial personality disorder, simply because I don't know her adolescent history and I would have to know that to diagnose. But I can fairly say that she might meet most of the diagnoses for every personality disorder in cluster B. If you ask me to pick one that fits the best,
Oh, we're asking. Keep going.
if you ask me to pick one that fits the best, I would definitely have to land on borderline personality disorder.
Okay.
The reason I would land on that is because that is the personality disorder that is the most extreme in terms of behaviors that push the envelope, behaviors that would be perceived as out of control, behaviors that are manipulative, that change on a dime. There's a tendency to over idealize someone and then to devalue them quickly. There's a tendency to shift moods very quickly. There's a tendency towards rage and anger. I would have to say,
And impulsivity, right?
impulsivity. Yeah, we'll be talking about all of these. I think of borderline personality disorder as a disorder of extremes. It's what I would call the over the edge personality disorder. It's the disorder that takes you to the edge and pushes you over, because when you're interacting with a borderline, it often feels like you're groundless. It often feels like you've just been pushed off a cliff.
Well, that's interesting. You said that Lori once told a friend that she thought about pushing her children off of a cliff because the end of the world was coming.
Didn't she want to drive a car off the edge of the cliff?
Yeah, it was a car. It was a car.
Right. So she wasn't going to push them. She was actually going to apparently ride with them. Turned out that she just pushed them. At the time, she was thoughtful enough to consider taking her own life, I guess.
Right.
And that, by the way, is another element, common element of borderline personality disorder, that there tends to be some history of suicidal ideation or suicidal tendencies, and in some cases, homicidal ideation. Oftentimes, suicidal and homicidal ideation will go together. They're sort of different sides of the same coin.
As you were saying, that one of the characteristics is you idealize someone and then quickly devalue them. Does that mean that there's a chance that she could go to devaluing Chad here and turn against him?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's something to keep an eye on. I think that if Lori comes to the realization that this is going to end badly for her and her only way out is to turn on Chad, I definitely think you might see that in the trial.
A lot of times people speculating on this case are asking, and I've joined with them in asking, so who's going to turn on who? Do you think it's more likely Lori turning on Chad because of that?
I think it's equally likely.
We'll have to wait and see.
I think in the end, they're both going to act out of self-interest. Borderline personality disorder people are probably more apt to shift their opinion quickly. So I think you probably would see Lori coming out swinging a lot faster than Chad based on this interpretation.
We'll see.
Let's talk about some of the extremes that we see in Lori. One is religious beliefs, obviously. We know that she's deeply invested in the cult. Even in this evaluation in 2007, the evaluator expresses a lot of concerns about her religious beliefs.
Yeah, it's really funny how this evaluator does it too. It's like they're tiptoeing around. Well, she's Mormon, so maybe this is normal, but I don't think it is.
The evaluator says in this report that Lori's belief system is riddled with ghosts and seemingly fanatical religious dogma. Her belief that Mr. Terry, I don't know who that is,
An attorney, perhaps?
her belief that Mr. Terry visits her at night borders on visual and auditory hallucinations. There's also, in addition to all the beliefs she has around the cult, at the time, she also believed that Tylee was the reincarnation of her deceased sister, Stacy.
Melanie's mother. So this is interesting because we do talk a lot about how Chad filled her mind with these delusions, yet she had some pretty fanatical beliefs before even meeting Chad.
Right.
These
Exactly.
are not normal Mormon or LDS beliefs that they're talking about here.
And these beliefs come from the Cox family.
You think?
Absolutely. I believe that these fanatical beliefs were developed in the Cox family. Given Barry's extreme dislike of the IRS and given Barry's extreme views, I feel pretty confident that this is a family who already had some pretty wacky beliefs.
And he was possibly schizophrenic too.
Well, in the custody paperwork, Steve Cope said that Stacy, the oldest daughter, had told him that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. So that would probably explain some peculiar beliefs.
So what are some of the other extremes with Lori? You mentioned that she was just a ton of extremes.
She's been married 5 times. That's pretty extreme.
True. I've only got 2 under my belt.
She wasn't content perceiving herself as attractive. She had to see herself as extremely attractive. So she enters a beauty pageant or beauty pageants to showcase her beauty.
Right. So she wasn't just content on feeling attractive. She had to prove herself to be the best.
Right. The most beautiful. And again, this would be related to the idea of a false self too, that she's seeking validation for her beauty. She's not content for how she looks in and of itself. She's got to enter a beauty pageant to have others reflect back to her beauty rather than simply accepting it for herself. We also see extremes in terms of her emotions, that when she was driving with Charles, she was trying to take his hand off the steering wheel so the car would crash. She goes from rage to extreme compliance.
We see that in the recorded phone call with Melanie and Chad as well. In fact, here's her going from an extreme, I love you, to anger against Melanie.
And I appreciate you and I love you. And I would never do anything to harm you.
Because I actually do care, I'm sharing what I feel for you because I know your salvation's in trouble for what you've done.
If my salvation is not in trouble at all, and I think you should check that with the Lord again. Never had any idea that you would be the person of all people to direct me. I cannot believe
I am asking questions and I am concerned for you. That is what somebody does when they care.
You don't sound like you're concerned. You sound like you're accusatory. You do not sound concerned. You sound pissed off.
Any other extreme behaviors?
Yeah, I think another area that people have been speculating a lot about has been in the sexual arena. A lot of people have asked me, do you think Lori was sexually abused? I think it's a great question. I think there's definitely some extreme behaviors. At the very least, there's a lack of sexual boundaries. If I can revisit for a moment all the areas that we know of that are documented about sexual problems in this family, it seems to add up. This definitely seems to confirm the old adage that when there's a lot of smoke, there's most likely fire.
Yeah, there's a lot of smoke here. And speaking of that smoke, it looks like you have a list of bullet points there. Let's hear what those are.
Let's run through some of the poor sexual boundaries that seem to surround Lori. Let's start with one of the most obvious ones. She was cheating on Charles with Chad. So there was infidelity, which in her world was a big deal.
In a Mormon world, that's a huge deal.
Right.
That is something you can get excommunicated for if there is infidelity or cheating on a spouse. You could actually lose your membership in this church she claims to be devoted to.
So let's start with that. That's a huge one. And Melanie Gibb, in her call, actually calls Lori out on that.
Like you being with Chad before he's even divorced is unusual behavior for a person that's seen Jesus Christ.
I was never with him and he was never divorced.
Honey, I've seen you
That's
guys
your
together.
story. That's you dating me.
So I haven't ever seen I've never seen you with Chad kiss him and walk around the track at BYU with him. I never saw that.
Here's some other areas where sexual boundaries seem to be very poor. We know that Lori sent Chad, when she was married to Charles, provocative. I don't know if she was naked, but she sent provocative videos. That was in the 48 hours segment. We know that Alex Cox took trips to South America for what I would call sex junkets with Latina women. We know that he did this on multiple occasions.
Alex being Lori's brother again.
We know from one of the court documents filed by Cheryl Wheeler, who was Charles Vallow's ex-wife, that Charles and Lori would have sex in front of Colby when he was a child. We know that Lori, for years, was saying that Colby was being sexually abused by Joe Ryan.
Colby and Tylee.
In Cheryl Wheeler's court report, she mentions that her children claim that Colby was sexually abusing them.
Not only that there was sexual abuse, but that no adult in the Vallow house seemed to be too concerned about it.
We know that Colby and the stepchildren in the Vallow household apparently had provocative pictures of Tylee, who was 4 years old, on their phone. We know that Lori made a sexually provocative comment to the police officer after Charles took her purse.
And she arrived at the police station to manipulate, as she always does so well, the situation. This is body cam footage of Lori being very flirtatious with police officers. At one point in the video, the police body cam is silenced, which means that they don't want the public to hear something. And during this, there's a lot of laughter, there's a lot of flirting. Tylee mentions knock-knock jokes, and then Lori takes over and says something that makes the police officer very uncomfortable. It's hard to hear if you don't have the visual, but it's been noted by a lot of people that Lori made an uncomfortable and sexual joke towards the police officer.
Okay.
Got any knock-knock jokes?
He dances really nice.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Good, like a little performance.
Here we go.
Show us
Okay.
your equipment. How...
Did you guys catch the sexual innuendo at the end before the awkward laughs? Here it is again.
Here we go.
Show us
Okay.
your equipment. How...
She makes that comment, by the way, in front of Tylee without any worry or care. I'll have a link to that body cam footage on our Facebook page if you want to see the entire video.
We know that one or several of the stepsons was residing in Tylee's room when she was 4 years old. We know that there was masturbation going on. Here's the guardian ad litem's assessment of that situation. Miss Vallow has now reported to the court and the child protective authorities that her stepson was recently in Tylee's bedroom after she went to sleep and that the boy was masturbating. According to the report of Cheryl Wheeler, the boy's mother, both Miss Vallow and Mr. Bell, said to her on the telephone that they knew the child was in Tylee's room.
In other words, that it was known and that was supposedly okay by Lori? Is that what it's saying?
Yeah.
Wow.
He goes on, the guardian ad litem goes on. He says, it is difficult to understand how Miss Vallow could have allowed Tylee to be alone with a 12-year-old boy after dark while she was in bed asleep.
Especially if you're claiming your little girl had already been sexually abused. Wouldn't you be doing everything in your power to keep her safe?
We know that Lori had begun a relationship with Chad, that Charles Vallow had returned to Texas, and that she flew to Texas to visit him.
To visit Charles.
Presumably having sex with him so that the insurance money would be reinstated in her name.
So in other words, she uses it as a manipulative ploy.
Right. She's indifferent to the fact that she can use sex to get her needs met. What else do we know? We know that Barry Cox, Lori's father, solicited a prostitute at least once, which if you've solicited a prostitute once and you're caught, you're probably doing it regularly.
Yeah, how many times was he not caught?
We know that the evaluator in the 2007 report was concerned enough about the lack of boundaries in the home to recommend a psychosexual evaluation for both Lori and Colby. These are all behaviors that have been documented. Imagine what we don't know. Imagine the secrets in this family, right? That's another part of an enmeshed family that I talked about last week, is the lack of boundaries everywhere. But in this case, obviously, there's a huge lack of sexual boundaries. There's an old adage in the mental health field: we're only as sane or sick as the secrets we keep. And you have to wonder how many secrets there are here. There's got to be so many secrets in this family. It's hard to imagine.
For generations, it seems.
Probably generations, absolutely. And so the Guardian ad litem concludes with this comment: the continuing chaos and sexuality at the VALLOW home, along with the noncompliance of Miss VALLOW and the treatment plan, constitute an emergency, and the court should issue orders instantly removing Tylee from Miss VALLOW's home.
Wow, who wrote that?
It's the Guardian ad litem that was in charge of making recommendations to the court about Tylee.
Wow.
I don't know why Tylee remained in the home, but let me quote that again. The recommendation is around chaos, the continuing chaos and sexuality. So let's speculate on this for a minute. Let's go back to this idea of sexual abuse that people keep asking about. A couple years ago, I was hired by a defense attorney to solicit an opinion on the case about whether there was sexual abuse. And the reason I was asked to do that is because the DA told the attorney that if there was a strong probability of sexual abuse, then the sentence would be reduced because they believed that the inmate in this case could be rehabilitated. Whereas if there was not sexual abuse, oddly enough, they would see it as more enduring sexual deviancy. The DA actually felt that if, in this particular case, the inmate, the perpetrator, was also a victim, that they were willing to be a little more lenient with the sentence. And so the inmate's mother had claimed that he was repeatedly sexually abused by his father as a young child. And he had made several statements as a young child describing the sexual abuse. But when I went in to evaluate him as an adult, he adamantly denied any sexual abuse occurring as a child. He was certainly old enough. He would have been around 5, 6, 7 years old when the abuse took place. He was definitely old enough to remember any type of sexual abuse, but he denied it. The father of the perpetrator was later arrested and charged with the possession of child pornography. That child pornography happened to depict children around the ages of 5 to 8. The mother was so concerned about it, she circumvented the court system because she was so concerned that the abuse would continue. However, in my evaluation, without getting a direct disclosure from the perpetrator in this case about sexual abuse, I had to rely on third-party sources, and in particular, my knowledge of the history of the father and his use of child pornography. He didn't have a lot of significant relationships. That would be also an indicator of probably pedophilic interests. There were some other things going on, but my conclusion here was that there probably was abuse. There probably was sexual abuse, because if a sex offender is viewing child pornography, the probability of pedophilic interest is extremely high. In other words, it's very rare for someone to watch child pornography without having a sexual attraction to children. The obvious conclusion was that there probably was sexual abuse because of the father's interest in child pornography, and statements that the perpetrator made as a young child that he later denied as an adult. I think
So why would the child then not share that there was sexual abuse with a person that they could share that with?
For the very same reasons that Lori would deny sexual abuse in her family, because the family's enmeshed, because the family is a very closed system, because the family does not want to show its secrets to the outside world, that there was a certain loyalty, even though this child, this young boy, was probably sexually abused by his father, he remained loyal to his family and his father, and he didn't want the secret to get out, because then his father would get in serious trouble, or more trouble than he was already in. So he was protecting the family. He was protecting the secrets in the family. And that brings us back to the Cox family. Was there sexual abuse in this family? There's no direct evidence. I don't have a direct link because nobody's disclosed it. But like this case I just talked about, I think there's enough evidence here of all these sexual boundary violations to think that Lori probably was sexually abused. But there's another way to approach this as well, and that is to look at the research on incestuous families. There's not a huge amount of research here, but there's enough to give us some indicators of whether sexual abuse occurred. One interesting study from 1980 by Dietz and Kraft found that incestuous families often had patriarchal and authoritarian fathers who lacked affection towards their children. The mothers typically were passive, depressed, and distant.
This could sound familiar.
Smith and Israel in 1987 looked at families where there was sibling sexual abuse occurring. They found that parental physical and emotional absence among the parents was the biggest predictor of siblings acting out sexually. So while we may look at all of the sexual boundary violations in the Cox family, and we can make certain inferences based on that about sexual abuse transpiring, we can also approach this from another angle, which is a top-down approach where we examine the research and see if it fits. And in this case, many of the initial studies on sexual abuse conducted in the 80s and 90s seem to fit the Cox family very well. It could have been her father. It could have been Alex. It could have been anyone in this family. It could have been a relative. I don't know. But I do know that this is a very dysfunctional family. It's a family that's extremely enmeshed. It's a family that will protect its secrets at all costs. To answer the question that so many of you have asked, I do think that there's a high probability, although I can't prove it with certainty, that there probably was some type of sexual abuse here. I wouldn't be surprised to see this secret come out in the trial in some way if the defense attorney believes it can benefit Lori in some way.
Okay.
How does this change our analysis of Lori and borderline personality? Well, it strengthens it. It strengthens it because trauma is often a very common element of borderline personality disorder.
As in, it's caused by trauma.
I wouldn't say it's caused by trauma. I would say that trauma can be a major component of borderline personality disorder in the sense that if you have a family that's narcissistic, like we discussed last week, if you have a narcissistic family where the false self develops from that, and then during those critical developmental periods, you have trauma, you throw in trauma into the mix, then the self becomes more enraged.
Okay.
Then you're taking a bad situation and you're making it worse. You're amplifying it.
Throwing fuel on the fire.
Right, exactly. And so you have, in this case, if there is sexual trauma, you're opening Pandora's box. You have a child who's not getting enough attention, a child who's not being validated. And now whatever little sense of trust there is in this family, you're betraying that. You're absolutely stomping on this child's will. Whatever this child is trying to protect of itself or in its developing personality, now you're quashing that. Sexual abuse is the ultimate betrayal. It's the people that are supposed to care for you the most. They're abusing you for their own satisfaction. They're treating you like an object. The family that's supposed to nurture you
and protect you
and provide for you is now treating you like an instrument of their sexual desires. And what do we know about some of the research on the relationship between sexual abuse and borderline personality disorder? One fascinating study by Weaver and Klum in 1993 did not have a huge sample, but it was sufficient to draw some reasonable conclusions. The authors found that the only predictive variable among several variables that predicted borderline personality was a history of sexual abuse as a child. They looked at physical abuse, they looked at family violence, they looked at dysfunctional family patterns, they even looked at attachment. And what they found was sexual abuse was one variable among all of those other variables that predicted borderline personality disorder. We also know from a summary of research by Wolf and Alpert in 1991 that sexual abuse leads to poor boundaries in all areas of life, impaired personality development, and, to use their term, a damaged self, which is consistent with my idea of a false self. So I think this is another study which shows some relationship between sexual trauma as a child and later personality disorders. And that, by the way, is why sex crimes are punished so harshly, because the emotional scars from sex crimes run so deep. It's not just the sexual acts, of course, that create the trauma from sex crimes. It's the ultimate betrayal in any family to use a child sexually for the adult's pleasure. It's one of those scenarios where the scars are immense and the children will suffer throughout their entire lives, often, especially if they don't get help, because they'll struggle to develop close relationships. Most sexual abuse children, they'll struggle with intimacy. And we see that with Lori, obviously. She's been married 5 times. She's been in crazy relationships. She's had an unstable relationship history. That's one of the hallmarks of borderline personality disorder. Another is the instability of herself. That's the false self. There's just all these extreme behaviors going on.
This is going to seem like an abrupt transition from what we were just talking about. It is now a few days later. I have finished editing this episode only to learn how long our dinner was. So we're going to split this episode, the mini extremes of Lori Vallow Daybell, into 2 parts. If this feels unfinished, that's because it is. This dinner went on for another hour.
We'll let you guys chew over this first part a little bit and digest it before we present our next part.
And if you're curious, here's the next question I ask. It will be the beginning of part 2. So it's one thing to have borderline personality disorder. In fact, John knows I have a good friend who is aware that she has borderline personality disorder and goes to therapy and works on it. But how does this lead to murder? There are a lot of people with borderline personality disorder out there that wouldn't murder somebody. That question will begin part 2. Before we end, we want to bring up what day it is today. It is September 8th. It's been officially a year now since the last known sighting of 16-year-old Tylee Ryan. Tylee Ryan was seen in photographs with her family in Yellowstone National Park, and in these photos, she was holding on to her little brother, JJ, who we have heard by all accounts that she adored this little boy, and she appeared to be protecting her little brother fiercely in this photo.
I think there's this sense that Tylee needed to move to Rexburg to be near JJ. There's almost this desperation that Tylee is clinging to JJ often, that she stays near him, that she's almost trying to protect him.
Yes, and that is what we have heard from some people actually close to the case and close to the family, that Tylee could have stayed in Arizona. She was 16 years old. She didn't know anyone in Rexburg, Idaho. She was moving for JJ.
And we know that Tylee was a victim of homicide in this crazy cult situation, but I suspect there were deeper levels of victimization with Tylee in the family. There may have been other types of abuse present. I don't want to speculate exactly on what those were, but it seems quite probable that as long as we're talking about abuse in this episode, that I want to acknowledge some of the painful experiences that I'm sure Tylee endured, in addition, of course, to the ultimate betrayal of losing her life. We would like to dedicate the first part of this episode to Tylee and to all other victims of abuse. Before we close, I'd like to tell a quick story about a case I was involved with over a decade ago. I was working with a little 4-year-old boy, and his mother had claimed repeatedly that he was being sexually abused by his father. After some extensive work with this little boy, I started to question that. The mother in this case was, I came to learn, a borderline personality disorder. It appeared to me quite clearly that she had coached this little boy. And even though he was 4, he was able to describe some abuse, but not consistently because of his age. The father, who was being accused of abuse, his defense team actually brought me on to try to defend him. It was a bit uncomfortable because my client was the mother, but I had to go by what I believed was true and accurate. And in this case, it really did seem quite clear that the boy was being coached. This situation reminds me a great deal of what went on in the VALLOW household. I don't know for sure who was coaching who or who was telling who to say what about whom. It's an enmeshed family. It's a family with no boundaries. It's a family with numerous secrets. But I do know this. I do know that the little boy I was working with was deeply harmed by the entire situation. I do know that the little boy struggled more with the false allegations than he did with any traumas that were occurring in the house. And I think I tell this story because I like to end our episodes with an aspiration. My aspiration here would be for Tylee and for all young children who are helpless and at the whims of their parents to have the ability to flourish without parents projecting and interjecting their own pathology onto those kids. My aspiration would be for all of us to try to see our children for who they are. I know I talked about this last week, but it's very important to me to reiterate this point. For us as parents to try to see our children for the innocent, sweet, struggling at times children that they are, who simply want to be themselves in the world. We should try to see our children for who they are and not for who we want them to be.
Because of the date, Tylee Ryan's aunt, Annie Cushing, wrote a tribute to Tylee on social media, and I responded. And I want to read to you what I wrote. My own tribute to Tylee. Tylee has stolen my heart. I wish I had known her. I wish I could have talked about her future with her like you did, Annie, as she hung onto every word you said and for that moment felt cared for and understood. There is something about her that draws me in. The girl I would have wanted to be friends with in high school, to laugh with and talk about boys, make funny videos, and march to the beat of our own drum. She was deprived of those years. Instead of prom, Tylee was protecting JJ. Instead of close friends, she was isolated and moving place to place. Instead of feeling any sense of safety, she had nowhere to turn. Nowhere. Both her fathers were dead, and not even her mom's God-fearing friends were a place of refuge. Instead, they plotted her demise. I've always said Tylee was smart. She was smarter than her mom and her mom's little cult. Tylee was a child of trauma, coming from generations of enmeshment and toxicity, but I believe she would have made it through. She was going to break the cycle, and I think that Lori knew. Lori was threatened by her smarts and determination. Lori knew what Tylee was capable of, a beautiful future free from her mom. That's what makes me the most heartbroken. As you, Annie, and Tylee sat there on your last visit with her, discussing her skills, her dreams, and talents, rather than Tylee's mother take interest, Lori was most likely thinking about how she could rid herself of this threat. Her daughter was a threat. Tylee was this thing in Lori's life that was becoming complicated, and so she simply decided to take this girl's beautiful future away. Rest in peace, Tylee. May your dad, Joe, wrap you in his arms and give you the love you always deserved. I wish so much this army that has formed in yours and JJ's name could have protected you. Instead, we're an army who will fight for your justice until the very end. And so this episode is dedicated to Tylee Ryan. May justice be served. We will be bringing part 2 to you shortly, the rest of this dinner. Until then, we hope that you will continue to share this podcast with your friends and know we always have a seat waiting for you at our dinner table. Thank you and good night. Stay tuned, everyone, for the next episode. Since we switched, we were going to do 2 episodes today, but we do have time, and we're going to be doing 1 more episode. Here it is. Hidden, a
Part
true
2.
crime podcast. A forensic psychologist and a journalist explore the hidden motives behind unthinkable crimes while examining our deepest fears along the way. I'm going to take off for a bit. Hello, this is Lauren Matthias.
This is Dr. John Matthias.
Before we begin, if you haven't listened to our episode, The Many Extremes of Lori Vallow Daybell, Part 1, we suggest stopping and going back and listening to that episode first before listening to this one. Everything will make a lot more sense since we cut this dinner into 2 parts. I want to let you guys know that there are a lot of people behind the scenes helping us that have reached out, people close to this case. People that are quiet about their research, that aren't there sharing it with thousands of people, but working so hard to help us understand this case. And one of those people is Cheryl Wheeler. And we want to say thank you to her for helping us find a lot of the documents we needed to understand this case better. We want to make sense of this tragedy and to possibly prevent future crimes or something like this happening again. so that we can see the warning signs. So thank you for everyone that has been helping us.
Thank you, Cheryl. It was very valuable talking to you and getting some of your feedback and information. We're very grateful.
Here is part 2. So it's one thing to have borderline personality disorder. In fact, John knows I have a good friend who is aware that she has borderline personality disorder and goes to therapy and works on it. There are a lot of people with borderline personality disorder out there that wouldn't murder somebody.
Yeah, in fact, one of the most committed patients I've ever worked with was a borderline personality disorder patient, and she struggled. It was a long, difficult process, but in the end, she did change. She did find a greater degree of contentment in her life. Although I think she recognizes it's probably going to be a lifelong battle, I think she was able to change, and she was able to develop a certain measure of peace in her life that she didn't have before. So I think it's important to keep in mind that even personality disorders are capable of change. There's actually been a really long-standing debate in the field of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis about whether borderline or any personality disorders can change. And the consensus has been for many years, since Freud, in fact, that most can't, so why bother? But that hasn't been my experience. I've actually witnessed borderline personality patients change, and it's been gratifying. Although difficult at times, it's been fulfilling and hopeful at the same time.
So do you think Lori could have changed?
The difference between Lori and the patient I worked with is that the patient I worked with wanted to change more than anything else. She was very dissatisfied with her life. She knew that she didn't want to go on the way she was living her life. So she sought therapy out because she wanted to change. Lori has no interest in changing. Lori is a diva who sees herself as perfect or near perfect. And so I can't even imagine Lori seeking out psychotherapy of any kind. In answering this question, it's important to point out that in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, one of the criteria, or actually several of the criteria that are necessary to diagnose any mental disorder, include impairment or distress. And so with Lori, I don't think there's much distress. I don't think with Lori that she would see any diagnosis she might have as a problem.
Really?
Yeah.
Like she would think of it as a gift.
No, she wouldn't think of it at all. It's just her life. That she's perfectly content living her life the way she does, in total chaos and on the extremes. And that's who she is. That's how she runs her life. I could argue that to some extent she enjoys all the drama.
So Lori is not someone who would have changed. But how does this lead to murder?
There's not a tremendous amount of research on this topic, but I do want to refer to a book by Carl Malmquist. It's an older book. It was written in 1996. Malmquist was one of the first psychiatrists to do some extensive research on the impact of diagnoses on homicide. In fact, the title of the book is Homicide, A Psychiatric Perspective. One of his chapters is precisely on that topic, about borderline personality leading to homicide. He believes that the following markers are significant in borderline personality disorder for potential homicide. Those are emotional instability. We see that with Lori. Rage. We see that with Lori. Suicidal and or homicidal tendencies.
Clearly.
We know about her threatening to drive off the cliff with her kids. Self-destructive behavior. We see that with Lori's reckless spending. We see that with
deserting her children.
Right, deserting her children.
And going to Hawaii for 58 days. How extreme is it to take off to Hawaii for 58 days and abandon your special needs child? She left Charles, left JJ, and took Tylee to Hawaii. By the way, that's actually when Charles decided to put his life insurance money into Kay's name.
Another marker is impulsiveness. We obviously see impulsive behavior here.
Yes, we do.
A sense of emptiness and fears of abandonment. Those are classic characteristics of borderline personality disorder. The emptiness speaks exactly to the idea of the false self that we've been talking about. And the most interesting one that Malmquist discusses is what he calls a disturbed sense of reality. This is interesting because people keep asking us about this issue too. Is she psychotic? Is she hallucinating? Is she delusional? This comes up all the time. And it's a really, really tricky question to answer because on the surface, she appears capable of interacting with the world in a way that appears to be normal. We see that in her interview with the police officers when she's placed on a psychiatric hold and she has to go in and talk to the police officers. She's more than capable of presenting herself as normal when she has to.
Very manipulative.
Right, very manipulative.
A lot of people have said they thought that she was the perfect mother.
That's a great example of being able to adapt. Even though she has these extreme religious beliefs, she's able to adapt to her environment well enough to deceive people. That would not be considered psychosis in the traditional sense. That would not be hallucinatory. That would not be delusional necessarily. I think some of her religious beliefs probably were delusional, but in the classic sense that people are asking about her, is she delusional? Not in the standard sense that she can't cope with the world and present enough of a facade to get other people to believe it. Let's listen to Malmquist on this issue, on this disturbed sense of reality. Malmquist says, quote, "Another characteristic that may emerge in those with borderline personality disorder organization is a disturbance in their sense or feeling of reality. This is different than their reality testing being impaired, such as in psychotic organization, where differentiation from others is difficult. Borderline personality disorder individuals are usually capable of distinguishing their inner life from the world of external events, apart from during any micropsychotic episodes that may be experienced. This is different than their reality testing being impaired, such as in psychotic organization, where differentiation from others is difficult. It leads people and organizations with whom they deal to misjudge their actual social capabilities based on external behaviors. What goes for social poise may be a thin veneer for lurking misinterpretations." So what Malmquist is saying is they have a very distorted sense of reality, but it doesn't rise to the level of being psychotic, that they're able to present this facade, or as he says, veneer to people so that they believe that they're oriented in the world.
And so this is how she comes across to many people as a healthy human being when they first meet her, or someone that wouldn't murder her children.
Right. That she has a disturbed sense of reality, but as Malmquist says, their social capabilities are sufficient to mislead people to not see it, unless she's talking about her extreme religious beliefs. And I think she probably is astute enough to know that discussion of her extreme religious beliefs with the police officers, for example, would present her in a negative light.
She understands this.
She understands that. She doesn't talk to the police about past probations or
reincarnation,
or the fact that Tylee is her reincarnated older sister, Stacy.
Now
She's
a
not
zombie.
bringing these things up right now. She doesn't talk about zombies or portals.
Except that she actually did bring it up once, showing that she couldn't completely hide it.
Right. She was able to mask it with the police. She was able to hide it on the surface, but in situations where she was asked to spend some time with people, as in her interview for the psychosexual evaluation for Joe Ryan, the evaluator was able to, over the period of an hour, discover these extreme beliefs.
True. The reason we even know about these beliefs, Tylee being the reincarnation of Stacy, is because of this interview. Here's what part of the evaluation says about Lori's extreme beliefs. Quote, "The mother, Ms. VALLOW, has explained to me on many occasions that she speaks with her deceased sister and believes that Tylee is reincarnation of her sister. Ms. VALLOW is deeply religious and seems genuinely so. However, she has also explained that her last attorney, Mr. Ted Terry, has come to her instructing her to attend his funeral and explain to his ex-spouse that he loved her." So did I hear that right? In other words, she wanted to go to her attorney's funeral just to tell his ex-wife that he loved Lori.
She wanted to make it clear that everyone loved Lori. So this isn't just everyone loves Raymond. Everyone also apparently loves Lori.
And don't tell her otherwise. And those are bizarre religious beliefs beyond LDS or Mormon doctrine.
Malmquist goes on. This is really important in terms of understanding Lori. It is well known that borderline personality individuals oscillate in their assessment of others between idealizing the others as good and devaluing them. The shift to badness raises the potential for their seeing another as a persecutor. Diverse primitive defenses related to omnipotence, omnipotent control, and devaluation and denial are common. These defenses induce an unevenness in personal relationships that contributes to impulsive behavior. The individuals shift from manipulativeness and arrogance to helplessness and seeking to blame others for their predicaments. And here's the line I really want you to pay attention to. In the midst of poorly regulated anxiety, depressive states and rage emerge with the possibility of acting on the murderous rage. Let me repeat that last line. Malmquist gets us to the place where we can understand how a borderline personality disorder would kill someone. In the midst of poorly regulated anxiety, depressive states and rage emerge with the possibility of acting on the murderous rage. It's the rage. It's the devaluation, in this case, of Tylee and JJ, treating them as zombies, idealizing them as wonderful children 1 minute, as portraying herself as the perfect mother 1 moment, and then devaluing them as zombies and nuisances and problems in the next minute.
Wow, yeah. When police do the initial welfare check, and police are asking about JJ's welfare and his whereabouts, Lori goes into some entire history of how they adopted JJ. I don't know of any mother that would talk about her child in such a distant way. Not to mention, the police weren't even asking about his history. Take a listen. And when she's referring to her or she in this, note that it's Kay, JJ's biological grandmother, who called for the welfare check.
Now, the person who called is my sister-in-law, but she's his natural grandmother. He's adopted by us. Okay, so her son, who's a drug addict, had a baby with a girl who's a drug addict, and they took him from, CPS took him, gave him to the grandmother. She came and got him, and then she wanted us to adopt him, which we did. We loved him and taken care. My husband and I.
That's not normal, is it? For a mother to talk about her baby boy that way? Like, and we adopted him.
Maybe if she's trying to establish some distance between herself and that child.
Which it seems like she was trying to do.
Right. And so I think it's this tendency to overvalue and then devalue. Malmquist points out that this extreme shift in perceptions often leads to rage because she feels betrayed by these kids. When JJ is an angel 1 minute and then a zombie the next, the response is rage. Why isn't this child behaving the way I want him to? Why isn't this child obeying me? Why isn't this child being normal? Lori's incapable of seeing her children as they are, just as we talked about with the Cox family. The Cox family was incapable of seeing their children for who they really were. Now we see that with these kids, with Lori's kids.
So she goes from in love with Tylee 1 moment to
being a zombie, to being someone who's interfering with her ability to lead the New Jerusalem with Chad.
So in other words, look out, Chad. You might be next.
You might be in the crosshairs, Chad. I hate to tell you that, but I hope you're not listening to this because
let's see how this goes down. So is this well known that borderline personality disorder has a tendency towards violence? And do they have a bigger tendency than, say, another personality disorder?
There's not a lot of research aside from Malmquist and a few other studies. There's actually a study that I think is probably one of the best studies looking at this. The study from 1984 by Andrew Lonis and Vogel. They had a fairly large sample of borderline personality disordered patients, 106 patients, psychiatric patients that they separated into various groups to examine the tendency to act out violently. They did a really excellent job of sorting out these patients based on their methods. So I appreciate the study. And they found that 70% of the borderlines had a tendency to act out. What they meant by acting out was to engage in violence towards others or property, to commit criminal acts, or to engage in promiscuity. This was a huge number compared to the other inpatients in this study who had schizophrenia or mood disorders or other mental health issues, that borderlines by far had the largest tendency to act out violently. And so I think this is an interesting study in the sense that it suggests that a large number of borderline personality disorders, probably based upon their rage and impulsiveness, have some reasonably high probability of acting out violently.
That's interesting because I would think it would be the psychopath that is likely to be the most violent.
And that's absolutely true. Psychopaths are by far the most likely to commit criminal acts.
Okay.
No question about it. And there's a ton of research supporting that. The studies I'm referencing, what they suggest is that borderline personality disorders probably have a greater propensity towards violence than we're aware of.
I see.
The point is, there's not a lot of research connecting borderline personality to violent acts or homicide. I had to dig deep to find these studies.
Why is that, by the way? More women are diagnosed borderline than men, and there always seems to be more studies with men. Is this one of those things?
There's a psychologist named Adrienne Rain who's done a lot of research on homicide. And one of Rain's big findings is if you're male, your risk of killing someone is exponentially higher.
Okay.
So for the men out there listening,
don't kill anyone.
Yeah, don't fly off the handle and kill someone by accident. Being a male, for whatever reasons, is a risk factor for violence. If you throw in antisocial tendencies, the risks go up tremendously.
Okay.
But, and this is where I think it's interesting, you're right, there's some bias. I don't know why there hasn't been more research on borderline personality and homicide, but I think one of the reasons might be that fewer females commit murder.
Right. And more females are borderline than males.
Right. More females are definitely borderline. In the study I cited, however, there were male borderline patients, and the females still had the larger tendency to act out violently.
Really, over the male borderlines.
In addition to the male borderlines. In other words, gender wasn't the distinguishing factor, it was the diagnosis.
That's fascinating.
As long as we're talking about the idea of extremes and how borderline personality is, as I said, it's a personality of extremes, extreme behaviors, emotions, extreme lack of self. I want to tie this in. Some of you have asked about this. I want to tie this in with the idea of terrorism. One thing that's interesting about some of the research on terrorism is, and I'm referencing a book by Adam Langford here called The Myth of Martyrdom. It's an examination of suicide bombers, terrorists who are willing to go so far as to kill themselves. The general belief prior to Langford's research, which was in 2013, was that suicide bombers killed themselves for a cause, that they become so wrapped up in the ideology or the cause of whatever it was that they were doing that they were willing to go to the extreme of killing themselves. What Langford found actually was mental health issues were the decisive variables. So Langford found suicide bombers shared a lot of mental health problems in common, including depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, some history of traumas. Many of them had the death of a loved one in their pasts. Some of them were sexually abused. But the point Langford raises is that people act in extreme ways, not necessarily because they're committed to a cause, although Lori was, I believe, obviously committed to a cause. People act in extreme ways because of past wounds and mental health issues. I think with Lori that the mission of Chad's cult, it allowed her to avoid feeling fear. It gave her the safety to act on her extreme mental health problems.
So this empowered her.
It empowered her, but it wasn't the motivation. I think this is really fascinating because Langford kind of reverses this and says that many of these suicide bombers would have committed suicide anyway. They just used the mission of whatever it is. They're able to hide behind the cause to justify their extreme behaviors that are really based on mental health issues.
But they want to feel it's with a purpose.
I think they want to transform their psychological pain into something meaningful.
Right.
And that brings me to a fascinating study by Gambetta and Hertog called Engineers of Jihad. It's probably one of the most extensive studies of extremism available. What the authors did was they went back and they looked at 4,000 cases of radical terrorists who were involved in jihads. And they attempted to discover some of the underlying patterns that drove their behaviors. Almost all of them were involved in some type of jihad or holy war. We could say, I think, the same thing about Chad and Lori, actually, to some extent, that they were engaged in a jihad.
Absolutely. The first time you wrote about this case, well, and you have always from the beginning said, these are terrorists. They are terrorists.
Yeah. And
Chad and Lori are terrorists.
And here we're going to get really close to this idea. They found 3 psychological characteristics of terrorists. The first was this overriding sense of disgust, this need for things to be clean and pristine. The second thing they found was that these terrorists tended to divide the world up into us versus them. And the third and most important factor they found was a need for closure. Hertog discusses these things. Let's take a listen.
And the 3 traits that are identified in the literature and that we also find using our own survey and data analysis are, in the case of Islamist and right-wing ideologies, a proneness to be easily disgusted. This is something that, interestingly, is quite closely affiliated with having right-wing conservative attitudes. So it's sort of need for cleanliness, for order. Then a rigid need to draw in-group, out-group boundaries. So to draw a clear distinction between yourself and your own group and people outside of that group. And there's quite a bit of evidence for that. And we find, for example, that engineers on average have much stronger anti-migrant attitudes all across Europe than people from other disciplines. And we see that as a proxy of this desire to draw strong social boundaries. And the final trait, which is the best analyzed and the best documented, both in our own research and in the literature, is what's called need for closure by cognitive psychologists. And that's essentially a need to avoid ambiguity, to seek clear answers, and to think of questions in a certain black and white fashion, to caricature it. And again, the indicators for that kind of trait are quite strong.
So I'd like to revisit each one of these characteristics quickly. The sense of disgust is really interesting to read. Remember at the other end of Chad's portal in the book, Reclaiming Liberty, that we read a few episodes ago, where he talked about this pristine world that was clean?
Once he got out of the portal, yes. Mm-hmm.
Here we see this notion of disgust playing out. As far as the us versus them mentality, obviously the 144,000, they're going to go to the New Jerusalem. We see that.
Us versus them, extremism.
The need for closure, that is precisely the topic we talked about in our third podcast about closed-mindedness. It's the same variable we're discussing here. The need for closure is this desire to believe that our view of the world is the correct one and that it's fixed, that we don't need to look at ideas outside of our worldview because we have the answers.
We are right, you are wrong,
Right.
us versus them.
And so what's fascinating to me here about this study and about Lori and Chad is that they meet all the criteria for terrorists. Both Chad and Lori meet all the criteria for terrorists. So I think it would be fair to say to some degree that what they were engaged in was a jihad. They weren't necessarily doing the killings, although I suspect that the 20,000 zombies that Chad identified as existing in the United States, I suspect that he wanted to eliminate them at some point before the rapture.
So would that mean that every cult or cult killing is more of a terrorist situation? Are all cults terrorists, or are a lot of terrorists just cults?
I think there's a lot of overlap between the aims of terrorist groups and cults. But no, terrorists by definition want to terrorize and create fear. They act in extreme ways because their goal is to paralyze people through terror. Whereas cults could have more benign objectives. There's a wide variety of cults that don't necessarily engage in terror. But I think here, I mean, it's interesting here to see that in this cult, when Melanie Gibb was consulted and interviewed, she was afraid for her life. We see a lot of this.
She said she was in hiding. Here's Melanie explaining her fears to East Idaho news reporter Nate Eaton.
And you've been hard to find.
I know.
Would it be fair to say that you've been in hiding?
Yes.
Why?
When you realize that the people that you know and you're close to and love have been involved in something that has to do with kidnapping and people dying, you start to think, oh my gosh, are they going to come after me? Like, everything closes in, and you start to think about your own safety, and you start to think about what really happened, and could this really be true? I had all kinds of fears.
When people started dying, these cult members all started becoming afraid.
And so that would be terror.
That would be more common of terrorism, right? So I think there is a lot of overlap, but cults probably have a little more diversity. And not all cults necessarily have violent means to achieve their ends.
That makes sense.
If we think of this in terms of terrorism, there's a tremendous irony here, which is that terrorists create fear, and yet they're acting from their own terror and their own fears and insecurities. Those are the things that compel them to murder.
Are their own fears.
Their own terror of being helpless and vulnerable, their own fear of humiliation, their own insecurities, all those wounds from childhood. come back to haunt them. Terrorists, if we go back to the Langford study about mental health issues, the sexual abuse and the death of a loved one, like Lori experienced, she lost 2 sisters. It's these things. It's growing up in the shadow of a major narcissist. It's the helplessness that Lori experienced as a child and the vulnerability. It's her terror of these vulnerabilities that compels her to murder in the end.
So you said there's this major us versus them mentality is one of their fears, their terrors, that the world would be full of people not like them, that don't believe the way they do.
Yeah, and that's part of the need for closure. That's part of the closed-mindedness that we've talked about with Chad Daybell, that they don't want to confront diversity. They don't want to deal with the world that challenges them or that challenges their beliefs. They want the world to be snug and safe and predictable. And so that issue I talked about in our last episode, the major defense mechanism for borderline personality disorder patients is omnipotent control. And Malmquist mentioned that too, the need for omnipotence and omnipotent control. That is the defense mechanism that covers up the helplessness and the vulnerability and all the childhood wounds that both Chad and Lori experienced. What's interesting about this situation is the children become scapegoats. The children become scapegoats to express their own humiliations and resentments from childhood.
Tylee and JJ.
Right. The children become a projection of their wounds, that by killing the children in some ways, I know this sounds strange, but by murdering the children, they're trying to murder their ghosts from their own pasts.
That's awful.
They're trying to exorcise their own wounds. Well, yeah, I mean, right. It is awful because it's so impulsive and non-reflective. And I mean, it's, yes,
Well, and
right.
it's evil. I'll say it. It's evil and it's sick.
I agree. But that's the world we live in.
Could we have known this about Lori, that she was capable of murdering her children? I mean, clearly many people saw red flags about her, but was there enough to know she was capable of this?
I think the rage and the instability probably left some clues. I think when she started talking about murdering people in her divorce papers and custody battles, when she started talking about murdering Charles or murdering people, we're picking up clues about that.
Well, and she mentioned in her custody battle all the way back with Joe Ryan, Tylee's father, that death would be an option before she gave Tylee to Joe.
And
Joe is now dead.
I think all this talk of harming others was a clue. If we go back even further, though, there's a really fascinating statement by Lori from her second marriage, where she filed a criminal complaint with the courts about her ex-husband, William.
This would be Colby's biological father, her oldest son.
So they were having problems. Lori claimed that there was physical abuse in this relationship. She is moving towards divorce here. She is trying to reclaim some of her property. And the fascinating thing about Lori's statement is that when I see it now, when you have a false self, you don't know yourself well enough to really express your values very well. That oftentimes, if you have a false self and you're talking about the people closest to you, they become a projection of you. They become a reflection of how you really feel about yourself. So this quote grabbed my attention because I feel like Lori isn't talking about her second ex-husband, William, at all. I feel like she's talking about herself.
Okay.
She says, quote, "William is void of any consciousness of right or wrong and lacks any virtue of good character. William's lifestyle is similar to a pathological liar and sociopath. He sees no wrong in using people for any purpose to get gain for his own needs and ambitions. He lacks integrity or any desire to accomplish or live a worthwhile or productive life. William is void of any light and intelligence to know the difference between right or wrong."
That sounds a lot like Lori. And that would not be the only time we've seen her project onto others what she really thinks about herself. That's not the only time she's said that about an ex-husband. Her ex-husband, Joe Ryan, she had told the evaluators that he was extremely manipulative and that he would twist how the evaluator saw things. So she would do this a lot. I believe you're right that she was talking about herself there.
She projects all the time. With the police officers, she claimed that Charles VALLOW was having an affair when she was. She was already with Chad at that point.
Well, and simply saying that she was concerned for Tylee's safety in the hands of Joe Ryan, when clearly what we should have all been concerned about was Tylee in the hands of her mother.
And the guardian ad litem pointed that out quickly and saying, get Tylee out of this home. Was Lori forecasting her own diagnosis back then? Was she telling us? Was she telling the courts that she was a psychopath?
Well, she did say that Joe Ryan was a sociopath, and that's why he manipulated people.
Right. So she's saying the same thing about her third husband.
Another projection, the police officer showed up for that initial welfare check. She claimed that Charles VALLOW, who was now deceased at this time because he was ambushed and killed by Lori and Alex, she claimed that Charles had been wanting to kill Lori for her life insurance money.
My other brother that was in with my husband who was trying to kill me for my $2 million life insurance policy.
When in the end, we have multiple recordings of her claiming how upset she was that she didn't receive Charles's insurance money.
Switched his life insurance policy to her, right?
To
his sister,
okay.
who got $1 million when he died. And we got nothing for me to raise JJ, and all the kids got nothing, and everybody got nothing. She got $1 million.
So many projections.
They go on and on.
And that is very common for human beings with false selves who don't know themselves. They don't know what they value. They don't know what they want. They weren't given that opportunity as children to really develop in a healthy way. And so it makes sense that they would then project their fears and their insecurities and their own inadequacies or fears onto others.
John knows I always like to call projection, you spot it, you got it.
Apparently, she spotted a lot of sociopathy in her second husband that was contagious.
Clearly, you spot it, you got it. Speaking of projection, you look very tired, honey. You must be so sleepy and ready to go to bed, I say, as I yawn and think that maybe dinner should be coming to an end because I am exhausted.
So I think you're trying to tell me that you're tired. It is getting late. We've covered a lot. There's still more to cover with Lori. As we move towards the end of dinner tonight, I keep thinking about a comment one of our listeners wrote on Facebook. And thank you, by the way, for your comments. They mean a lot to us. We take them very seriously. We really appreciate interacting with you guys when we can on our Facebook page.
Our Facebook page, Hidden a True Crime Podcast. And I know what comment John is referring to. I actually have it right here. It's written by Paige Rogers in reference to our last episode, episode 6. I've been waiting for this episode and you did not disappoint. While I have many thoughts to mull over, I can't help but be overcome by a bit of sadness. As a former professional in the field of early childhood development, I am, in slang, picking up what you are putting down. Tonight, in light of my professional experience and that I am a devoted Christian, and having just finished your new episode, I just can't help but be moved to grief and empathy for those who are reared in the types of families which you discussed. I mourn the childhoods that they should have had. It is all just so heartbreaking. I keep thinking about the children who are being raised in such families at present. I just wanted to say a prayer for those children.
Lauren received this comment on Facebook and she was so touched by it. She immediately took it into my office and read it to me.
And actually, let me tell this story because John is going to leave something out and I want it to be talked about. I went and gave him this comment or read to him this comment from Paige because I knew that it would be meaningful to John. And then I left his office, his home office, and decided to go say hi an hour later. And you were emotional. And do you want to tell him why you're emotional? Because that's what I want to talk about.
The comment brought me back to reflecting on a lot of the evaluations I've done over the years and all of the victims on the other side of every crime I've assessed. And I think I was experiencing some sorrow. One of the things Lauren knows about me is that when I'm experiencing some sadness or some sorrow, that oftentimes that's a good place for me to go and write. So I began working on a blog post as a tribute to our son, Banks. I actually started an Instagram account last year that is comprised of a series of love letters to my son, Banks, who's now 3 years old. The reason I did that was because around my birthday in 2019 in July, I went in for a MRI because I'd been experiencing back pain for about a year. And I thought the back pain was related to an old sports injury and it was just getting a little worse. I went in for my MRI on Thursday, and on Friday night, late, I received a call from my doctor, which I didn't take to be a great sign, by the way. Usually your doctor's not going to call you late on a Friday night with good news. He's not going to call you to wish you a good weekend. My doctor told me that they had discovered 5 tumors on my spine, my lower spine, and he said that the most likely culprit was the brain. In other words, he said, you probably have brain cancer, and there's a type of tumor called a drop metastasis that moves from the brain into the spinal cord. In most of these cases, especially when there's multiple tumors, the diagnosis is going to be brain cancer. So that evening, I was very emotional. And the next day, Lauren and myself and our 3-year-old Banks, we decided to do what I always do when I'm trying to escape, and that is to get out into nature. We went to the Kolob Canyons in Zion National Park, which is also, by the way, where we eloped 3 years previously. At that time, we both thought that I might not have much time left to live. There was a lot of sadness. There was a lot of tears shed. We didn't talk a tremendous amount. I think we just wanted to be in nature, to let some of that tranquility wash over us, given the gravity of the news that I had received. But one thing we talked about, one thing I committed to, was that if I had a limited amount of time left, I wanted my son to get to know me because he's so young. So I told Lauren that I needed to start an Instagram account and to write a series of love letters to my son in the event that I should die, so that he would know who I was. And I told Lauren that there were a couple books I wanted to write, that I had to commit myself to doing that. Of course, I had to work to make money and support the family, but I committed to spending all of my free time either with my family, working on projects that would allow my son to get to know me. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons I'm writing the book Immunity. It's primarily about a relationship between a father and a son. And it's an area I really wanted to explore. Although it's not autobiographical, it's very personal. And it does talk a lot about the father-son relationship, which was something I thought would be important for my son to understand should I not survive for very long. I went in for an MRI on my brain the following Monday, thinking that I probably had brain cancer. I'll never forget being in the MRI tube with all the noise and the claustrophobia. If you've ever been in an MRI tube, it feels a lot like being in a coffin. At the moment, I thought it was a precursor to my future. So I was deeply afraid at that moment that I might not survive. That evening, Lauren's brother, who's a doctor in Salt Lake City with a lot of contacts, he had one of his physician friends read the MRI, and he called me and he said, John, yes, you have these tumors in your spine. We don't know where they're coming from, but your brain's clean. You don't have cancer. We'll figure out where the tumors are coming from, but you're not in immediate danger. And that was a tremendous relief to me. It left a lasting impression on me in the sense that now I take nothing for granted, and every moment I have is important to me to spend with my family and or to leave a legacy for my son, so that should something happen in the future, or should one of my tumors metastasize in my spine, that he will know who I am. So I sat down to write this letter to my son because I was feeling such sorrow. And it also was a moment of intense reflection on all the victims that I've mourned for over the years that have been on the other side of every crime I've had to assess.
I'm so glad you shared all that. I was hoping that you would share some of that, but I wasn't sure if you would share all of that. And I'm so glad you did. And I want you to know, guys, it wasn't just starting an Instagram account. It was putting himself on social media for the very first time. He's never had any account anywhere until this Instagram account. So what seems simple, starting an Instagram account, to John was a huge deal. I'm also glad he talked about it because I hope that he'll continue posting more. He hasn't posted a while, but it's at Dr. John Matthias. Doctor, as in DR, John Matthias. And that's where he's put his love letters for our son. I think this might be a foreshadowing. I'm looking at him. Will you be posting something soon again?
I'm working on a post called A Homage to Boys. I'm actually going to dedicate it to our son and to JJ. I hope to get that posted within the next several weeks.
I like that you shared you're going to post it, because once this podcast is published, you have to post it. But I like that you also threw in several weeks so that you can have a little bit of space.
It'll be posted within the next month.
There you have it. At Dr. John Matthias. That's his Instagram account. When I came into your office and I saw you emotional, can I ask you what was going through your mind at that moment?
I think I was just feeling sorrow because I was remembering so many of the cases that I've been involved with where the victims were like JJ and Tylee. The victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were at no fault whatsoever. And
everyone failed them.
Right. Everyone failed them. I don't know if there was a reason, but I think in that moment it was important to connect to some sorrow, because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is about the victims, and that we started this to provide some insight into why this happened and how we might prevent similar situations from occurring in the future. And I think it's hard to do that without connecting to some deeper sorrow. And it's that sorrow, by the way, that connects all of us. I feel like if Lori and Chad had the ability to understand the consequences of their action and its impact on the community, and to connect to some deeper sense of sorrow or grief, they never would have considered this.
In other words, their lack of sorrow and lack of grief
and empathy
created this tragedy.
Right. And so I think I was experiencing a few deeply mournful moments, because I need to, from time to time, remember why I do this and to connect to something much deeper than myself. One of the questions I get all the time from family members and colleagues is, how can you do this? How have you been able to do this for so many years? Doesn't it just absolutely wreck your soul? I think it's good for me and us and to experience some sorrow over this particular case and any other true crime story where there's a victim. I think it's important not to lose sight of that. I think it's something that allows us all to connect around grief. And in my grieving over all the victims I've worked with over the years, I actually thought about a story that the Dalai Lama told in a well-known book called The Art of Happiness, which is an interview with the Dalai Lama by Howard Cutler, who's a psychiatrist. And the Dalai Lama was asked by Howard Cutler if there was anything in his life that he feels bad about. The Dalai Lama told him a story about how he was approached by an elderly monk who couldn't perform certain yoga poses due to his poor physical condition. He told the monk just simply to cut those positions out because he was too old to do them. And then the Dalai Lama later learned that the monk had committed suicide because he believed he would be reincarnated into a younger body, and thus he'd be able to do the exercises. When the Dalai Lama expressed to Howard Cutler that he felt a tremendous amount of regret that he had unintentionally been responsible for this monk's death, and Howard Cutler asked him, he said, "How do you ever get rid of that feeling?" And the Dalai Lama paused for a long time, and he said to Howard Cutler about his grief and about getting rid of that feeling. He said, "I didn't. It's still there. I just don't allow it to drag me down and pull me back. I realized that being dragged down or held back by it would be to no one's benefit, not mine or anyone else's. So I go forward and I do the best I can. And that's how I feel. I feel like it's really important for me and for all of us, I think, to some degree, to connect to our sorrow, to remind us that we're human, that we're vulnerable, that we experience grief, that we all have losses, and to recognize that on the other end of every crime, there's a victim that I think is tragic and that we, at some level, hopefully need to mourn for.
John has helped me understand that sorrow is a part of life. And he's helped me understand that I know that when I feel sorrow or grief, I try to accept it rather than try to push it away, which I'm pretty sure is something that Chad and Lori never did. Honestly, face any sorrow or grief. I know that John's talked about that in past episodes. John and I were listening to a video of the Dalai Lama about how humans can find happiness in spite of our sorrow. And we decided together we wanted to share this tonight. It's hard to understand everything the Dalai Lama is saying, but the video on YouTube does have subtitles, so we'll have a link to that video on our Facebook page.
In your experience, what makes you truly happy?
I believe the peace of mind. That peace of mind also is to come firstly from heartedness. That I think reduce ill feeling towards other and also reduce this sort of distrust. I always open. I never consider myself as something special. If I consider myself something different from you, like I'm Buddhist, even more, I'm His Holiness Dalai Lama, or even if you consider I'm Nobel laureate, then actually you create yourself as a prisoner. I forget these things. I simply consider I'm one of the 7 billion human beings. We are mentally, emotionally, intellectually, we are same.
Let me just offer a few final reflections on the Dalai Lama's comments about happiness. His idea that happiness is a function of peace of mind, I think, is really relevant to this podcast tonight, because when you're on the extremes, when you're pushing the envelope and you're on the edge, like Lori, all the time, when you're ready to self-destruct, when you get to the point where murder seems like a good option, you're not going to find peace of mind, right? And so peace of mind is the complete opposite of Lori and Chad. Also, warm-heartedness that the Dalai Lama talks about, complete opposite of Lori and Chad. Or how about staying open? We've talked about this so many times, but staying open is also the opposite of the need for closure that we talked about tonight in terms of the most compelling reason that terrorists resort to violence. The Dalai Lama reminds us of the importance of staying open. And finally, he also reminds us that we're all the same. We're all in this together. We're all part of the same community. And when we try to set ourselves apart from the community, it's not going to go well. Chad and Lori and this cult, they obviously didn't see themselves as a part of the community. They saw themselves as separate, special, above it. So he reminds us of that. And as we end this, my aspiration tonight will come from the Dalai Lama and his saying, quote, "So I go forward and do the best I can." I think that's the most I could ask of anyone. I think that's the most I can ask of myself, that every day I just try to go forward and do the best I can in spite of the grief, in spite of the footprints from the victims that I have to confront. I just want to move forward. I don't want to forget them. In spite of the sorrow, I just try to move forward and do the best I can. And I wish the same for you.
With dinner coming to an end, we want to remind all of you to please share with your friends that we have a seat for them at our dinner table as well. And if you like our podcast, if you would please leave us a review on Apple or the platform that you listen. We appreciate those reviews so much. You can find our Facebook page at Hidden a True Crime Podcast or facebook.com/Hidden True Crime.
Thank you also so much for your comments. We do read them, obviously. We talk about them. We bring them into our podcast when we think it's useful.
We discuss your questions. We love your questions.
We anticipate doing a live podcast at the end of this process to field all of your questions in greater depth.
Yes, at the end of this season, we want to do a live Q&A.
My wife looks exhausted. I think she's going to fall asleep if we don't wrap this up. So
all Venus flytraps need their beauty rest.
Unless they're feeding on predators. Thanks for joining us. I want you guys to stay safe. Don't forget to wear your helmets. Stay out of dark portals.
Or light portals. Light portals too. I think portals in general.
Stay out of any portals.
Stay sane.
I'd like to have a special guest take us out tonight.
Stay safe and wear a helmet. Don't go into portals.
Remember that we're only as sane or as sick as the secrets we keep. We'll keep a seat open for next week. Thanks for joining us. Good night.
Good night.
Hidden.
All
a
right.
true
Goodbye,
crime podcast.
everyone. Oh,
A
hold
forensic
on.
psychologist and a journalist. We'll start there tomorrow. The fearlessness and filicide of Lori Vallow. Daybell. So that will be tomorrow's beginning. All right, everyone. Thank you for being here. Please do share with your friends about our podcast. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And we will see you tomorrow to continue our 3-year watch party of our revisiting our original podcast. Bye, everyone.